What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode of Faith Unaltered. I am one of your co-hosts for this evening, Tyler Fowler. With me is my brother from my Canadian mother, Dale Glover, and our special guest with us this evening, Caleb Jackson. Guys, what is going on? Dale, we'll start with you. How's your weekend been, bro?
Well, it hasn't started yet, but yeah, pretty good.
Hey, it's Friday. It is the weekend officially. I know you're in Canada and y'all do things different up there, but here in the U.S., Friday is
Friday
weekend
night.
Day.
Friday night weekend begins. All right, cool. Yeah, no, everything's good on my end. I was really upset on Tuesday night because we had a great show lined up. I brought on Dr. Shabir Ali to do a discussion on Jesus, crucifixion, and Trinity. Yeah. But I found out that because Dane was jealous that I was number one and he was bumped to number 0. He did something to my internet, and I wasn't able to be on that show. But
we did.
Yeah, hopefully, I'm in talks with him, so hopefully we can reschedule and continue on with that. But I thought the show between Dane and Shabir on the Trinity was really well done, and yeah, they both did a great job.
I told Dane, I said, bro, that was your most challenging discussion yet, because Shabir, I mean, obviously, you know, he is a pro whenever it comes to Muslim apologetics. And I really have a lot of respect for Shabir because of that. I mean, he's took on some of the best apologists. I know I really enjoyed his debate with James White. And for Dane, who is all in all, and Dane will even admit this, really a nobody in the apologetics field, for him to take on Shabir like that in that setting, in an informal dialogue setting where they push each other, you know, back and forth and this, that, and the other, I thought he did really well. I thought there was a couple weak points, obviously, from both sides. Obviously, whenever Dane brought up Revelation to Shabir, and Shabir said, "Whoa, I gotta think about this. I don't know." I thought that was a slam dunk for Dane, but then, you know, Dane had some issues where he had to say the same thing pretty much. So I thought it was overall even, and I thought, you know, Dane did a really good job hanging in there. He hung in there, and so that's the good part. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. No, he's doing good because I've thrown a couple. I threw Dr. Dale Tuggy at him and then Shabir Ali. So he's going up against the best on the other side, kind of thing. So yeah, absolutely.
That's right. So let us know whenever Shabir gets back with you, because we're going to have Shabir back on to ask him more questions. So I think this time, the next time, after your show with Shabir that obviously I'm going to participate in, we're going to do another discussion, hopefully, if Shabir's up for it, where we set more in kind of the driver's seat and ask him questions related to the conversation between him and Dane, and even, you know, the conversation that you guys are going to have. I'm sure topics and questions will come to my mind, because I didn't get to ask any in that discussion with Dane. And so I really want to press Shabir, and you know, and now that we've got the video, instead of thinking of questions off the top of my head, like I can sit down, write them out, really plan them, send them to him, you know, so it's all fair and stuff, and then have him back on to ask questions to him about that. But other than that, guys, we got a really good show lined up for you. Josh just came in, and so this is going to be an even better show now, but we're talking about near-death experiences, and I subtitled this Contact with Angels and Demons, and the reason I did that off the bat is I've been listening to a podcast that I really love, and Dale's probably going to hit me. If he could reach through the internet and smack me around, he probably would. But I've been listening to a lot of Mr. Ballin lately, and there was a podcast that he recommended, and it was called Bedtime Stories. And basically just scary stories, you know, and I work graveyard shift, and so I like getting freaked out a little bit sometimes by myself, mind you. I work. And I've been listening to this podcast, and there was a episode that was entitled Don't Let the Darkness Get You, or something to that effect. And I said, okay, this is going to be interesting. And it was about near-death experiences and people who had bad encounters with something. Let's put it like that. I would say demons, if not imagination. So if this is real and not just made up in these people's mind, I would call what they're describing demons, obviously. But people differ on that. And so then that really led me to search out near-death experiences from a more professional level instead of anecdotal level. And so I went and bought Dr. Paul Grayson. I think that's his name. Is that right, Dill?
Dr. Bruce Grayson.
Bruce Grayson. I don't know why I keep thinking his name's Paul. Yeah, thank you guys. Dr. Bruce Grayson.
Earlier in terms of saints, I think that's what you had on the mind.
That could have been. Yeah, that very well could have been. But Dr. Bruce Grayson, I don't know if he's written a couple books. I know he's got one book out about this. Okay, a couple.
Oh, yeah, he's written lots of books. I'm holding one now. My favorite is the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences.
Okay.
He's like probably the lead researcher in terms of like art. I know he's done a lot of articles, but there's literally something called the Grayson scale, which is like a measurement of near-death validity. So it's like he's pretty influential. He's a major player in the literature on near-death experiences.
Right. And so I saw a book by him on Audible, and the title of it is called After. And basically, it's an account of different people that he's interviewed and his thoughts behind it. From 40 years of research. From the time that this one lady in particular, I still remember her name. Her name was Holly, and it was about a spaghetti stain on this dude's shirt. She was out cold in the hospital room. He leaves the hospital room to talk to the person who brought her there, and the next day, whenever he comes to talk to Holly, she said, "I saw you," and he's like, "What are you talking about? You were out cold." She said, "No, I saw you talking to my friend, and I saw the spaghetti stain on your tie." And that freaked him out. And that's what led him, according to this book, to study near-death experiences and what would entail all of this research. So 40 years of research by the time he's written this book. And there was a lot of things in there. And so I want to talk about those things. I know Dell's got things prepared to talk about, and Caleb does too. And we've introduced Dell. So Caleb, I want to go to you. How's your weekend been, brother? So far anyway? And what do you have? Let me just ask you this just off the top to give our listeners a little taste. What do you have prepared for us tonight?
Yeah, so in terms of my weekend, it's been going well. Not been too busy, so that's good. Some downtime. It's a slower time during work. Nice. In terms of preparing for this, so I think I said, at least to Tyler when he was asking me this is not something that I'm an expert in by any chance. I mean, I don't have a degree in anything that's relevant to this. So I guess I can't call myself an expert hardly anything, but I have been doing a lot on miracles, which is sort of a subset of the paranormal, parapsychological literature, but not directly, analogous to it. But I have read a decent amount on this, but I would come in more as a skeptic of this, not because I have any bias towards like materialism. I'm a Christian, obviously. I believe in the afterlife, so I'm definitely open to it, and I do think that there are things there, but I do think that often the case for these is overstated, which is ironic because a lot of people don't think that it's talked about enough in apologetic literature. So I'm kind of here to try to look at this as objectively as I can, but I will probably express any skeptical scenarios that I might have about it. So right now I'm sort of agnostic in terms of what exactly we interpret from near-death experiences, whether they're valid or not, and how we look at that. So yeah.
Right on. And Josh, what's up, brother? I was not expecting you here tonight, to be honest with you.
I wasn't either. I was actually told by my wife that I was supposed to have my son had a friend that wanted to hang out or whatever, and we were going to go to the park.
Yeah.
Apparently my wife is having a hard time today with her body is aching in her back and stuff, and so she's having a hard time moving around right now. And so we just decided to reschedule that for Monday and give her some rest time, and so here I am.
Well, it's good to have you. I hate that has happened to Emily, and so we'll definitely be praying for her. Lord have mercy, and we hope that she gets feeling better, obviously. But it's always great to have you here, brother, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say about this. What do you think, just off the top? And then I'll go back to Dell because I kind of skipped this question with you, Dell. But what do you think off the top whenever you just hear about near-death experiences? Are you more on the skeptical side, more on the believing side? Like, where do you kind of fall into this this phenomena that we're going to be talking about tonight?
Well, I have the tendency to be skeptical in general of most things.
Yeah.
And so I like if some random person on the street was like, I almost died in a hospital bed, and when I was dead for just a few moments or a few minutes, I saw X, Y, and Z. I'd probably start with, that's really interesting. What led you to think that was what you were experiencing was something that, you know what I mean? So my first question would be an unguided kind of, why do you think that was an authentic experience? Right? I'm not doubting that they had the experience.
Right.
Well, I'm not skeptical that people have these experiences. So that's where my skepticism ends. I believe people are having these experiences, and I believe they're weird, and I believe that they need, some level of attention. and then perhaps they have some explanatory power, but I would not be the first person to just hear someone tell a story and be like, yeah, that's true, obviously, because you said it. Like, so in that sense, I'm skeptical, but at the same time, as somebody who's experienced some very weird things without having to die to do it, I would say I probably would have a softened heart toward people who are willing to explore the experience and even recount it. Let's say it barring those people who go on, like, the 700 Club and talk about heaven and all that. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about, like,
I
people
came
that
across a lot of those in my preparation for this. Just saying.
yeah, the people that are not getting overt notoriety because of their story, I'm more likely to believe. Right? Like the people that get that stand to gain nothing from talking about this, the same way that the apostles stood to gain next to nothing for being martyred for what they knew better. If they were lying, they knew they were lying. It's nuts, right? So it's like the person who stands to gain nothing from telling the story is more believable, but I would say my first inclination is to try to figure out whether or not this person was in a position to have a weird psychological experience, or if this is something that was authentic. But like Caleb said, I have no reason to doubt the existence of metaphysical beings or an afterlife or any such thing. That I am not skeptical of at this point. But I would definitely approach the anecdotes with some skepticism. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I hear you. And so whenever we're talking about skepticism, because I'm like you guys in a sense. So what I mean by that is I truly believe that these people are having some kind of experience. Whether now what the explanation for that is where the skepticism comes in. That's where I want to be like, okay, let's ask questions to get to the bottom of this, right? And that's what I really like about Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is a clinical psychiatrist. He has received a lot of awards, from my understanding, and been in a lot of places of like my mind's kind of blanking on me, but he's been in a lot of high places, I'll put it like that, within the psychiatric field. And so starting there and then working his way up to near-death experiences, he's got a lot of criticism from it. He's been threatened to be thrown off boards if he continues in this field of research, because back then, I mean, from my understanding, and I would love to get Dr. Grayson on to discuss this. I know Dale has had him on his show, so if y'all are interested, please go watch that episode with Dale. Very similar to what we're going to be talking about tonight, if not one for one. And so, but just Bruce's attitude toward this field in general, coming out with writing the book, and now a lot of people are following in his footsteps, and a lot of his colleagues are working on this together. They're coming up with a lot of different theories that incorporate spiritual, right? So the spiritual sense and the science. So it's not like we see a lot in our day and age, science and religion kind of enemies with each other. And that's not what Bruce is doing. He's trying to explain these spiritual experiences with a scientific method, and that's what Caleb was talking about earlier. He came up with this NDE scale of how you rate, people that have near-death experiences and what their score is. And we'll get into a little bit of that later. But Dale, I want to go back to you before we dive in. What do you think about near-death experiences just on a surface level? Are you more on the skeptical side, or more on the, let's these people are seeing something, but let's question what that is? Where do you stand?
So I am definitely a believer. I would say, so Gary Habermas is a friend of mine, and he's the one who put me on to NDEs and stuff like that. And he always asked me, like, where are you? So the last time I did an in-depth study, which was, over a decade ago, I would say I'm about 60 to 65% convinced that these NDEs do exhibit evidence for substance dualism and the separation of body and soul. I do not believe, as the name implies, these are near-death experiences. So I am very skeptical, and I don't believe that they are experiencing the true afterlife. And that's proven in the fact, I guess we'll get into it, but I mean, the experiences themselves as to what they see, that they call the afterlife, is very much culturally dependent or religiously dependent. It is clearly filtered through the lens of their own understanding of their culture and stuff like that, right? Hindus will see Hindu gods and all that stuff. So yeah, I know today is kind of about the paranormal and angels and people seeing angels and demons. On that, I'm very skeptical and kind of not interested. My focus was all strictly on the veridical NDEs, where they see stuff in this world and then figuring out, well, can that be explained naturally or not? So that was kind of my primary focus. And on that end, yeah, I'm convinced on a balanced probabilities, we have some good evidence that is suggestive of substance dualism and implies that, yeah, maybe there is a life after we die. It implies that, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to get into vertical NDEs, right? And so, Dale, can you just describe for us, you talked about the difference between paranormal and veridical. Can you just describe for our audience what is a veridical NDE?
Yeah, so basically just an NDE in general is where you become near the point of death, and because of that, your soul is set to separate from your body. Now, in some cases, some people don't go to heaven or hell or whatever it is. They stay here on earth, and they will observe certain things that it couldn't be possible for them to see, right? Because if we are just a body, they're totally out. In some cases, they have a flat EEG or flat EKG. We'll get to that. And they're observing things in the operating room that aren't common knowledge, or they'll observe things out in the waiting room. Or we have some cases where they're observing ambulance people miles away from the hospital, and they're getting these details right. And the thing that I'm most impressed with is when people like Dr. Bruce Grayson, they're recording the details right after the patient awakes or becomes conscious again right away. And then these things match up. So there's no opportunity for collusion where I heard later on, and yeah, I saw that. Yeah, you were smoking a cigarette. Okay, yeah. You were voting for Joe Biden. You lost your mind. Okay, yeah, I saw that. No, so that's kind of what I'm interested in terms of the veridical NDEs. They observe elements that are proven to be veridical and that are, let's just say for the sake of argument right now, hard to explain naturally.
Right. Kind of like the spaghetti stain on Bruce Grayson's tie that Holly saw. I've heard of other. So the one that stands out to me from the book, so after, is that there was this one guy. And now the thing that I found interesting, and so I'll get back to the out-of-body experiences here in just a second. But the thing that I found interesting, guys, and if y'all want to comment on this, please do. And by the way, if y'all see something floating around my camera, I swear it's not an orb, it's a gnat. Okay, so let's not get paranormal here and say, there's ghost haunting Tyler. No, it's a gnat, and I'm trying to catch it.
Or is it?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
An out-of-body experience, and they're just floating around your house, and
somebody right now is watching us do the podcast out of body. So
tiny angels.
Is your patron?
It's Polycarp. Yeah, it's Polycarp. Stop it! Like, go on somewhere. That's terrible. That's terrible.
He never had a chance to be on a podcast. He just wants his turn.
Bro, he's been on a podcast ever since I hung him up there, so he ain't got no complaints right now. But anyway, the thing that I found interesting from Bruce Grayson's book anyway, now I don't know, now keep in mind, guys, this is the only book that I've read by someone I would call a scholar in the field of NDEs and of psychiatry that deals with NDEs really on a daily. And the thing that I found that he attributed to in his book is that a lot of these people, something to do with their heart, right? Whether they're having heart surgery, whether they're having, a heart attack, something with their heart. There's a lot of correlation between NDEs and heart disease, which if you guys want to comment on that, feel free. But with that being said, I find that extremely interesting. And now don't get me wrong here. So I'm going to go off into left field for just a second. But we all know of like the new age stuff. Dale and I have interviewed a quote unquote psychic whenever it comes to like new age and this, that, and the other. And we've all heard, I would hope anyway, that we've all heard of these things called chakras. And the chakra, one of these chakras is with your heart. Now, I'm not trying to say, hey, look, guys, chakras are real because people are having NDEs that are having heart attacks. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I just find it interesting that the correlation between a like an Egyptian mythology, they talked about the heart being something special, right? There's that soul floating around. Polycarp gone. But they talk about the heart, and whenever Bruce kind of affirmed that, that stood out to me a little bit. So is there anything that you guys want to comment on that before we get deeper into the subject?
Well, I'm particularly drawn to the continuity of like an ancient story, narrative, symbolic kind of use of what we now understand to be like an operative organ or a muscle in our body. They figured to be almost a powerhouse of your living being, right? Not necessarily just the thing that happened to move blood throughout your body. They didn't think of it as a motor. We think of it as a motor because we understand it as a kind of mechanistic part of your biology. And they didn't think about it that way. And the intuition that that's rooted in kind of seems to be something that wasn't perhaps accidental, but was, let's say, unguided enough to be gone in different directions without guardrails that might go into some weird stuff that, like the idea of a chakra being something that is a center of energy or one's essence, or concentrations of the sources of one's aura or something like that, and all the language that kind of buzzwords around it. I think the idea that this is developed from is actually not all that foreign at all, because Christ talks about our heart as something that we can use to honor God.
Yes.
Right? And so that's one of those things that I think, if we're to love God with all our mind and all our strength, we understand that to be the division between our mind and our body.
Yeah.
But that division is neither wholesome nor final. And we were reminded of this in the incarnation itself, and then again in the sacraments, that matter and meaning are not mutually exclusive. They just aren't. And then the heart being added into that is a really interesting thing, because it kind of connotes the association that they're making is that the seat of your passions, your desires, and the part where your person touches your body seems to be the heart. And so I don't find that odd at all that would be a correlation to these experiences. That seems completely reasonable to me if that's what this is talking about. I think that seems to be an immediate connection, even in my mind, intuitively. So that to learn that those are actually correlations is actually kind of gratifying.
You went exactly where I was going to go. So if nobody else was going to comment on this, that's Matthew 22:37. Love the Lord. This is Jesus speaking now. Love the Lord God with all of your heart, mind, body, and soul. Right. And so with that being said, the heart there, the Greek is kardia. And that is, so the way I've been taught to interpret that word, just glosses, and now we can look at BDAG if we want to, but it's basically your heart, right? This organ here, or what's also called your inner self. And so it's amazing to me that the Greeks would use that word to describe both of those things. And that, for me anyway, presents like this, maybe not necessarily a one-for-one, like the heart is the inner self, but there was correlation between the heart, the inner man, and the inner self whenever it came to the word kardia. And we see that used in a lot of different contexts. But like you said, Josh, Matthew 22:37 is where I wanted to go because of what Jesus says. And so this isn't just like this pagan notion of chakras that I led this into, right, but this is, the heart is something that is center within Christianity. This comes straight from Jesus's mouth himself. And there's a lot of different things and a lot of different passages that talk about the kardia. And I like I said, like you just said, the correlation between those two baffles me, that we are seeing that in NDEs with people that are having heart failure, heart surgery, whatever the case may be. There's like this kind of correlation. I don't know the numbers that Dr. Grayson would attribute to, but just saying that most, not all, I don't think it's all, but most of the patients in his book, because remember, he's a clinical psychiatrist, most of the patients in his book that had an NDE, now granted, I know that's arbitrary that he's picking and choosing those people whom he puts in his book and whom he writes about, but most of them had something to do with their heart that had an NDE. Caleb, Dell, is there anything that you guys want to comment on that before we move on?
Okay, so I'm not sure if there is this correlation. This is I had never heard that before. So I'm just kind of wondering. Um, I know for a fact that there are accounts of NDEs where it has nothing to do with their hearts. So those cases do exist, definitely, right? So I'm just wondering, if is it in terms of this heart correlation, could it be because, well, those are easier to detect, right? So you can, for example, have a flat, what is it for the heart? Is it the EKG? EKG, I think, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So that's kind of like an easy way. See, it's vertical. We have medical proof that it stopped or something like that. Maybe that's why they're highlighting that. But there are also cases where there's that flat EEG in terms of brain activity. And at least from a modern perspective, that's way more important because that's what the atheists and skeptics say. Look, what are we? We're our brain. It's
Right.
not the heart, right? They follow Galen, who was the first one who kind of saw that the brain was, he called it the king of all of our senses because he saw that everything was connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so this is the first time I've never heard that there is a specific connection to the heart, and I'm not sure if that's true or not. But yeah, I don't know enough, so maybe Caleb.
I just did a quick search on Google, and according to National Institutes of Health.gov, incidents and correlatives of near-death experiences were reported at least 10% of patients with cardiac arrest. And so that's just one heart issue that accounts for apparently 10% of what they had even reported. So that I find that to be interesting enough. Tyler indicated it was something of a majority, but even if it wasn't, the association of ancient intuitions with the heart and the connection of the soul to the body being somehow related to the heart, whereas in modern day we kind of think about our self or our person or our being or soul is inhabiting here right behind the eyes, because we think we're a brain. Like that's most modern people think that we're a brain trapped in a body somehow,
Right.
rather than thinking about a soul as something that inhabits the whole of the body, which is ironic because your brain through your nerves extends to your whole body. So that's a rather apt analogy as well. But the ancient people seem to have a pretty universal intuition that the heart was related to that. And so it's not, I still think that it's really interesting that even if it's a minority of the cases, that correlation seems to have some merit, but
on that
I'll have
website.
to look up more on that, like Dale said.
Okay, out of curiosity, Josh, just before we go to Caleb, because I don't want to dominate, but since you're on that website, what does it say for other things? Like how many people have NDEs that had a brain failure, or I don't know, whatever, something else happened?
Let me see if I can read a little bit more and find out what you guys go on.
Okay.
Caleb, is there anything that you wanted to?
No, I didn't have anything in particular. I was just going to say that I think, from my understanding, I would guess is because most people who have near-death experiences, who have, they're basically brain dead, or at least temporarily, is because there's lack of blood flow to the brain. There are cases where people have brain damage, but I think in those cases, it's pretty rare for them to come back and be neurologically, functional. Typically, they'll be impaired where they're not going to be able to recount to you in an interview what happened. There are exceptions to that, but I think the point is, like, you're more likely to have, you can have brain damage without oxygen to the brain for more than 5 minutes technically, but I feel like if it's a nervous issue in the brain, like a head injury, that's going to be harder to recover back from than losing, being brain dead from lack of oxygen. So I think I would guess that the people who have those experiences is sort of like the survivorship bias, because they're more likely to survive if it's a heart issue than a brain issue. But that would just be my guess.
Right on. So since all of us have kind of talked about the brain at this point, I find it interesting. So first and foremost, so in the Audible version of the book, and Audible is not a sponsor, I love Audible, and so for anybody that's watched Faith Unaltered, y'all know that by now. But there is an Audible version of the book after, and Dr. Bruce Grayson did an interview with from my understanding in this field, now you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, a pretty famous case of a neurologist that actually had an NDE, a near-death experience, and his name's Dr. Eben Alexander. Yeah. So with that being said, he goes into his story a little bit in the book, and the things that Eben described, I don't even want to go there. But to my understanding, both Eben and Caleb, if there's something you want to say on this, feel free. And even if it's not really correlated to what I'm getting ready to say, that's fine. But Bruce he doesn't like lay out a chapter where there's an argument. He just kind of mentions it in passing. And I want to get your guys' opinion on this, that there's a lot of like scientists that are on the materialistic side of things that would say the brain impulses, and Caleb, I think I brought this up to you in our chat, but that the brain's electrical impulses is what stimulates our thoughts and our consciousness and all these different things, right? The brain is the machine that is what gives us life in a real sense. But and I don't know if Bruce Grayson is a Christian or not. Do you guys? Okay, I didn't think so. But but Bruce actually argues, he mentions it in passing, I should say, in the book after, that he doesn't think that model's correct. He thinks there's a better explanation. I'll use his words. But rather it's vice versa. And that our thoughts and our consciousness is actually what stimulates our brain activity that we can, hook up EEGs to can see that activity. So instead of the brain's electrical impulses and things like that stimulating our thoughts and, our free will, so to say, it's the other way around for Bruce Grayson. And this is not, a Christian coming from this. So I'm just curious, Caleb, I know you had mentioned Eben. Is there anything you want to say about him specifically, or what I just said about Bruce and his ideas whenever it comes to the thoughts actually causing the effects of the brain instead of vice versa?
Well, I mean, I'm sympathetic to substance dualism. I kind of go back between dualism and panpsychism. So I definitely agree that the brain is not. Yeah, I know.
Definition? No, I've never heard of panpsychism before.
Oh, it's like the idea that like everything is sort of individually conscious and stuff like that. That can be discussed. Whether, fair enough. But no, I'm sympathetic to dualism. But anyway, so the case with Eben Alexander is actually published in a neuroscience journal back a couple of years ago. I forget the year. I do talk about it a little bit in my book. Just in the context of the Miracles book I'm doing, I mention it because it's one of those cases where you have a case published in a medical journal. This is not this is a mainstream journal, where it actually, Eben Alexander, actually, his family prayed for him to come back, and he did. So it's like technically a case that involves prayer, but it was only mentioned incidentally in the article because it was something that was verified by him while he was unconscious, right? So he had a kind of meningitis which is inflammation to the brain, right? And it was a particularly nasty kind that made him like lose sight and completely go into brain shock very rapidly. Mm-hmm. And so he was out for, I think, 4 days, and they basically thought he was going to die. There was no improvement. Then his family comes and gets around him and starts praying for him. And this is pretty unusual because they didn't let anyone in. I'm sorry, it wasn't just his family. It was like other people, like friends and neighbors who he didn't talk to that much. But this was like on the fourth day, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have a normal policy of letting people in every day. So this was like an exception to the rule. Mm-hmm. And after a few hours after they did that is when he started regaining heartbeat and stuff like that. And so he I think comes back to consciousness the next day, and it takes a few days to recover. He's first has some neurological impairment, but he makes a full recovery within 2 months and is perfectly normal today. Yeah. In that way. So that's a case where the reason they mention the prayer is because when he has a near-death experience, he sees a lot of stuff, but he mentions seeing in the hospital room people around him, some of which he didn't know, praying for him, right? And this was verified by the hospital staff, and they mentioned in the article this is unusual because they didn't normally let people in with those kinds of cases. So the article only mentions it incidentally, right? So I'm saying, like, if that hadn't been the case and he had just had a normal near-death experience, they probably wouldn't have mentioned that detail. So the reason I was mentioning it in my book was to say that there's probably a lot of cases that involve prayer that don't get the journals just don't feel the need to mention that because they don't think it's relevant to it. Mm-hmm. But the fact that he got better right after that is sort of like prayer was only mentioned accidentally because it was saying, well, he saw this while he was unconscious, and that's something notable that can be verified. So they just sort of incidentally mention it. Right. But yeah, no, it's really interesting case. I wouldn't say that his cure was miraculous by my criteria. I would say it was very remarkable and very unlikely. But in terms of the near-death experience, I don't really, know what to think about it in terms of, I don't think it's the most interesting case of like a veridical experience, but it is one that's documented pretty well and is published in a journal. So I know there's been a lot of feedback and some people push back against him. And I think even Sam Harris wrote like an article against it or something, because Sam Harris is also a neuroscientist, right? But yeah, so it's definitely one of the more well-known cases.
Right on. Thank you for that. Dale, Josh?
Yeah, I'll just add, I'm interested in what you said, because so first of all, it's interesting hearing that Caleb might be a panpsychist. Okay, I had no idea. Wow. Okay, that's crazy. Awesome. Good to know. But I am definitely and solidly a substance dualist and substance dualist interactionist. So in terms of the interaction issue, right, I definitely believe that, look, our souls, our unembodied souls, interact and engage with our physical bodies. And the first instance of that has been scientifically proven to take place in the brain, right? That's where the first signals pop up. And then we can, from there, science takes over and see, okay, the intervening mechanisms for how we move our arm or how we do stuff. And there have actually been scientific experiments in neuroscience proving that people are aware of something, right? Making a choice or something like that slightly before, like milliseconds before that activity actually shows up in the brain. And then blah, 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 the physical sequence takes over. But I think that it's also important to note that the reverse is also true, right? There's it's a two-way interaction. So when a physical thing, if someone pinches me or something like that, that's starts physical and that goes into the brain, and then that engages with my soul and I feel the sensation of pain. I don't think pain, that sensation, is physical in nature. Color isn't something that's physical. That's a sensation that only the soul can apprehend, right? Even though what starts it is purely physical. Light reflects at a certain wavelength and comes into my head, whatever the explanation is there, right? So that's the only thing I wanted to qualify, is that with substance dualism interactionism, there is a two-way interaction that goes. Our soul can influence our physical brains and bodies, but the reverse is also true. So that's the only thing I want to tell you.
Can I ask a follow-up real fast on that? Because I think when it comes to the I agree the interaction problem is not really that compelling as an objection. But I have wondered when it comes to these things, it makes me skeptical, is when people talk about like an unembodied soul, it's immaterial, right? If you're saying that now it's separated from the body, at least temporarily, how is it that people describe, they typically describe these spatially, right? Like, I'm in the room, I see this. They're not like omnipresent in most cases, right? It's within but how does it make sense to describe an experience where you're like spatially contained and yet you're also immaterial? Because I feel like there'd be nothing constraining them to just a room, since it's not material, right? So it doesn't really, I feel like to be immaterial would be to be like omnipresent at that point, like God at that, essentially. So it is kind of weird to think of it in that way. I think they're describing as if they were spatial, physical things, which they're not.
Well, okay, just to respond to that. So first thing, while the soul's in the body, believe it or not, I do believe that in a way we're omniscient. We are what philosophers call holomerically present and spatially located at our bodies. That's where, just like God is said to be holomerically present, you could argue he's holomerically present. That's his omnipresence for the universe. But when it's separated from the body, there are two aspects, right? So we would say that the soul lacks spatial extension, but it can still have a spatial location. And that's what I think is happening with the soul. It's spatially located, floating above the body or wherever it is when it's looking. But that doesn't have to imply that, well, it's got to be spatially extended, like, oh, it's being stretched out through all of space. I don't think that has to follow. So yeah, I don't know, Josh, if that's my answer. Hopefully it helps. But
I just think it's interesting that on both ends we kind of have to assume a physicality in some sort. You're saying that it can be physically located without having outward parameters, and Caleb's saying, well, if it doesn't have any walls, it should fill the space like a liquid. It's like, I feel like in both cases we're kind of assuming that's like space and matter are involved in the conception of how that would be somehow physical or non-physical or material or immaterial. I think that the entire thing is something that's beyond the framework of my understanding, because I have to think about reality through the lens of my senses. And if I were immaterial, I wouldn't have sense data. So I'm not entirely sure how viewing or any of those things, there's a lot more complications for me other than the size of an immaterial body, if you want to call it that. You don't have eyes, you don't have sense data, and somehow you're still seeing and hearing and perceiving. It's just all very strange. You know what I mean? And so there's something that's going on under the surface there that kind of illuminates to me that our sense data is not necessarily as confined to our body as we would perceive it to be, if that's the case. That's what I would add to that. But in terms of what you had asked before, Dale, because I was still reading and looking up some stuff, I found a study on hypothermic circulatory arrest for aortic surgery triggering near-death experiences, the incidence of near-death experiences after aortic surgeries performed under hypothermic circulatory arrest. So in other words, a slight ceasing of the blood flow of the body throughout the body because of the way that they have to work on the heart. There is, in some sense, a moment of arrest, and they were trying to see if that induced near-death experiences. And in that clinical study, there were precisely 0 in near-death experiences. And so it's an interesting thing that when they were looking for it, it didn't seem to be a correlation at all.
Which is funny, by the way, because that's one of the most famous cases of Pam Reynolds, I believe, was, I don't know if it was that exact procedure, but it was something very similar to where they froze her and I think drained the blood out of her because they were operating on the brain, I think it was.
Wow.
Pretty well-known case. If you look in the literature, there's also a lot of back and forth because it's a well-known case. There's a few responses and critics of it, and back, you know, it's kind of like the Shroud, where you'll have someone put forward like a major point, and then there'll be like 3 papers respond to it, and then there's a response to that paper, and it's just a tennis match at that point in terms of getting to medical technicalities that I'm not really qualified to understand who's winning the argument.
Well, I just wanted to be fair to the fact that, you know, we were talking about something, and we were talking about, this correlation, this thing. And so I thought it was interesting that in the case where they were looking for it, it wasn't there. But in the case where we weren't looking for it necessarily, there was a correlation to be found. But it seems like perhaps a medical procedure versus a health issue would also be something that's a relevant distinction between those two things too, because somebody who's going into cardiac arrest because they have a health issue versus somebody who's having that induced on them to see if something was going to happen is not exactly the same scenario. And so perhaps it has to do with the trauma to the body being an occurrence of the body rather than to the body. Maybe that has something to do with it too, but obviously I'm just speculating. I just thought it was really interesting that when they looked for that correlation, it wasn't there, because they were specifically looking for whether or not that procedure from the heart and the lack of blood would induce a near-death experience. So I thought that was really interesting.
Well, I like how you said that, Josh, you know, that you're speculating. And that's honestly why, like, I kind of got this panel together. Obviously, I didn't know you were going to be here, but, you know, like, we don't have to be, I mean, don't get me wrong, guys. Like, as much medical accuracy, like, as we can give out, but obviously, you know, I would love to have. But obviously, none of us here are, like, medical experts because we're not doctors and we don't have MDs behind our name, right? And so with that being said, like, I'm totally cool with speculation, and that's great. So, Josh, keep it up, brother, because I find that interesting, and I encourage it more. Dale, I think I saw you unmute, and then Caleb will go to you after that. Go ahead, guys.
Well, just something Josh said. It's unrelated to what Josh was saying, but it's something he said. The way he said it sparked, like, what, you know, our expectations and how things, when they're looking for something, it's almost like it evades us. And something that I found really interesting is that Bruce Grayson, he actually participated in 2 of 5 controlled studies studying NDEs. And
right,
the thing that kind of has bothered me for a while is that all of these 5 controlled experiments failed, right? The patients that did have NDEs, they would put what they would do is they would put like a colorful thing on the ceiling, or, you know, hidden from plain view, so the patients wouldn't know, and stuff like that. And then, okay, of the ones that reported an NDE and floating above the body towards the ceiling, they would ask, did you see anything strange or anything like that? And all of these experiments failed. They didn't catch this thing. So
So they hid something. I don't mean to cut you off, Dale. So what you're saying is, like Bruce Grayson and the controlled experiment was, they hid something specific that the controllers knew, and then they wanted to see if the person having the near-death experience found this particular thing that they hid. Is that right?
Exactly. It was something that was designed to draw your attention, or it was like a sequence. There was somewhere it was a sequence of numbers or something like that. Like, and all of these failed. So I actually asked Bruce, Dr. Grayson, when he was on my show, like, well, how do we explain that? Like, isn't this proof for that the skeptics that maybe this isn't really happening and stuff? And he was saying, well, think about it. I mean, first of all, think about it this way, right? When you're just in a near-death state for the first time in your life, and you are looking down at your body, going, "Oh my gosh, I'm dead," and what's going on? Where am I? And stuff. You're not going to be looking around on this in the corners of the ceilings to see if you.
Where's that thing that they hid?
You're looking down at the doctors or your family, and your focus is strictly there. So, so in a way, he was saying, like, these controlled experiments were designed to fail, and they prove nothing because no one's focus would be on these things. They're going to be on their families or what's going on with my body and stuff like that. So I just wanted to add that about having proper expectations before we dismiss something or whatever. So
well, or something out of character, right? So for example, what I'm talking about is that there was an anecdote that Bruce wrote about in the book after, about this one gentleman. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he had an out-of-body experience. And by the way, for our audience, we're not saying a near-death experience, or at least I'm not, we're not saying that a near-death experience is the exact same thing as an out-of-body experience. I think the two are totally different. I was talking to my wife the other day, and she said that she's had an out-of-body experience and described it to me in detail. But just from what it sounded like, and again, I'm not a medical professional, it doesn't sound like she was near death at that point. It's just something that happened, and it's a phenomena that I can't explain. I'd love to go, talk to somebody about it later and maybe get some more info about it. But just to caveat this conversation, I'm curious your guys' thoughts on this, and then Caleb, if you want to respond to what Dell said, I'd be interested to hear it. But I'm not saying that an out-of-body experience is the exact same thing as a near-death experience. Would you guys agree with that, or not so much?
I think it's a relevant distinction, yeah.
Dale, any comments on that before we go to Caleb?
Yeah, so I was trying to find a quote in the video or something, but yeah. Absolutely. Bruce Grayson and NDEs recognize there are clear differences and distinctions between out-of-body experiences and what we call near-death experiences and stuff. So that obviously there is a superficial similarity in that, the soul is said to separate from the body or something like that, but there are distinct differences. And I was looking for a clip to play, but I couldn't find it in time. So
no, that's fine. Keep looking for it. We'll play it here in a little bit if you want to, since it's your interview, and we're
Faith YouTube algorithm. I'm giving permission to Faith Unaltered to play the clip in full or in part. If you don't like it, you can shove it.
So no copyright, YouTube. Like, get on with yourself. But the story I was going to mention real quick, and then we'll go to Caleb, is that there was a gentleman that had an out-of-body experience, and he specifically remembers the surgeon flapping his arms, like just out of character. Caleb, you know what I'm talking about, but just flapping his arms. And apparently, come to find out later, Bruce talks about it later in his book, that this surgeon had made it a practice, and I think off the top of my head, he might have been from like one of the Koreas, North or South Korea, something like that. But he always made it a practice, and he was the only one that has done this, to my understanding. But every time he scrubbed up and washed his hands and decontaminated himself, he would not touch anything, like either with gloves or whatever, and he would use his elbows to like point. And something happened to where he started flapping his arms around, and it just stood out to the dude. So to Dale's point, a person, I mean, you put yourself in a person, whether you've had an NDE, and I would be very, very curious if anybody is watching our show, whether it's live streaming now or in the future after this has been released. Have you had a near-death experience, and would you like to describe that for us You can either do that in the comment section below, or if you want to keep that private, you can always email me at faithunaltered@gmail.com, and I would love to hear about your experience. But that's the thing that stands out to people. I mean, you put yourself in the shoes of somebody that has an out-of-body experience. First of all, I don't think you're going to be looking for the Barbie doll in the corner or whatever they hide, right? You're going to be focused on your body and the immediate surroundings of that, that specific thing. So your body and whatever's around that. More times out of none, it's surgeons, it's the bed, it's something that the people are doing to you. That's what my wife said that she focused on in her out-of-body experience, that her brother was sitting there next to her, and that she was out. So, and she said that she was looking at herself and at her brother staying with her, saying it's going to be okay. So it might have been an NDE. I mean, like I said, she was out cold. I won't go into the details about how she got there per se, because I don't know if she'd be cool with that or not. But that's that's what she related to me just a couple days ago. But Caleb, let's go to you, and if you've got anything to add to what we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, so I think that Dale made several. I mean, everyone's made good points about why it's sort of frustrating to study these things, and prayer is the same way. But whenever you try to set up controlled studies in advance, they typically don't go the way you want. Usually, you have to do these on a case report analysis after the fact. In that way. And I think that I know Dale was probably talking about the AWARE study, which is probably the most sprawling one, the most well-known one. And as far as I understand, they actually had a very small sample size at the end of it. They had, over 1,000 patients over the long run, but most of them didn't even have an NDE. And of those who did, which was like maybe 10, I think, most of them were too sick and recovering to be able to do an interview. So like 2 of them were able to do an interview. And one of them was in the other room. He wasn't in a room that had one of the things. So when he wasn't able to see anything. And then the one guy that they did interview did describe his resuscitation. So it's like you got one maybe out of like a lot. So it's just kind of difficult to know, but there are some details. But I think that the best way to study these in theory would be to take instances, especially with resuscitation, because those are well documented in terms of there's a procedure and it has to be recorded. At this time we did this many chest compressions and all that stuff. There is one book that was published by, I believe it was Penny Sartori in 2008 called, hold on, I have it right here. Near-death experiences of hospitalized intensive care patients, a 5-year clinical study.
Oh, wow.
And from what I remember this, which was really interesting, is that they had a control group after the fact. So how they did it is like they had people, I think it was cardiac patients and heart issues, who were brought back. Some of them described near-death experiences. They interviewed them asking how the resuscitation went, right? So, they rubbed this and then pumped my chest 3 times, all that stuff. And some of this stuff is kind of technical, right? Doing the order. Now you might say, well, people watch TV, they've seen medical shows, they know how the general process works, right?
Right.
But what is interesting is when they asked the control group who did not have a near-death experience, they just interviewed patients who woke up, who never had it. They said, how would you describe your resuscitation? How do you want that went? And the ones who were sort of just guessing were way less accurate than the ones who claimed that they saw it. So they were guessing, were just doing the stuff you would think you would just sort of see on TV, whereas the ones who had a near-death experience were much more accurate in the step-by-step, the order, the process were much more specific. So I think that's really interesting. And so if there's a case where someone allegedly sees something, like with Pam Reynolds, one of the well-known ones, where she had basically all the blood drained out of her body and was brain dead, and she was able to tell like what they were using to shave her head and the song that was being played and all that stuff, even though she should have been out. And she was under anesthesia. And I think there was something in her ears that makes like a clicking sound that like they do for the drill, so it doesn't like shake out their head. I don't remember the exact details, but she got like remarkably well documented. And so some people said there have been articles published by skeptics saying, well, maybe she was a musician, so maybe she has a trained ear, and if it was done at this moment, she might have been able to hear it. And that's possible, but the thing is that the naturalistic explanation is also speculative and hasn't really been demonstrated. So there have been authors who've challenged those skeptics to say, well, let's take people who have the same procedure and see if we can replicate those results. If you think that they're just hearing this, then let's replicate. Not like we're going to force people to be that, but people are already having the surgery, and let's see if they can do it in the same way she did. And no one's ever taken up that offer. So I think that's sort of a way, like if you could repeat it if you could repeat it where they could hear it under those conditions, I think that'd be good evidence. And they didn't have a near-death experience. I think that'd be good evidence against the near-death experience, the legitimacy hypothesis. But if they can't replicate the natural explanation, I think that's evidence against it. So that's sort of how I think the best way you could look at these are. Is like, we need to look at these and see if we can replicate it. If you think these are based off of people guessing and getting lucky or hearing things at certain times, then let's see patients who are in very similar situations, very similar procedures, who don't have near-death experiences, see if they can tell you with the same degree of accuracy how it happened. Right. And if you could, that would be good evidence against it. And if they can't, then we would need to ask, why can't the control group replicate this?
Right on. Thank you for that. That's interesting to me, like, by far, because I thought the exact same thing that you mentioned was that people would recollect like seeing something happen on TV, but maybe it can be said, well, they never experienced that before. The people that just guessed and was like way out of whack. That just seems like kind of coincidences stacking up, though, at that point. You know what I mean? So right on. I appreciate that, Caleb. Josh, I saw you unmute.
Well, it's obviously related because of the topic, but unrelated to what Caleb was talking about necessarily. I'm kind of
go ahead.
Curious what you guys think about, because I'm thinking about this on the back end of kind of the whole idea of study, right? Mm-hmm. In the way that we perform it, and the scientific method is all relying upon reality to be something that's regular and observable in its regularity. Why do we think that it's merited to assume that immaterial reality is just as observably regular as material reality? And is that a silly assumption? And that's why we're getting skewed results? Is that why our expectation is awry? Is because we're making demands of an immaterial reality that doesn't behave the same as material reality? What do you guys think of that?
Caleb, you're my guest, so I'll let you go first if you want to.
No, you're good. I'll be brief. I was going to say, I mean, like, theoretically that's possible, but at that point it would just be unfalsifiable. And if you want to bite that bullet, that's fine. But I think at that point they would say, well, look, there's no way to distinguish between a hallucination at that point. If you're talking about something that's subjective, that can't be verified, versus it being actual. So if you want to show that it's has some veridicality in our world where they're seeing something physical, they might not be physical, but the thing that they're seeing, a doctor, whatever, is physical. I think that could technically be tested. But if you're saying, well, we just can't, for all we know that the spiritual world plays by different rules, yeah, you could make that. But that's an argument I've heard a lot of skeptics make, that you just can't test, supernatural things because there's no even conceptual thing you could do to falsify it or test it or know it, because you could just say, well, maybe it works this way. So yeah, I think we have to have some kind of bounds in order for it to be meaningful, at least empirically. If you think it's not empirical, then that's good. But I think the point of this kind of podcast is looking like if we could view this empirically and verify. Otherwise, I don't know how we would assess the legitimacy or illegitimacy of these claims.
Right.
Well, I'm not talking about the legitimacy of an individual claim. I'm talking about the inconsistency of being able to recreate such a claim by way of inducing a artificial scenario, like an experiment, to try to make it happen again, as though what we were doing was something that was happening by way of a mechanism rather than something that was happening because of some other thing that we just don't have any conception for. I believe that the vertical experiments you guys are talking about, which are being verified by something that was actually physically present in the room, that is either true or false in that material way. But the idea that we can repeat said experiment simply because we put someone in the same scenario, I think that might be a faulty expectation, if that makes more sense. I'm not saying that it can't have any correlation. I'm saying that if the spiritual reality that's actually participating with material in that way happened to be some sort of anomaly that we don't understand, the anomaly might have some explanation, but how do we have access to that? And so there are ways to verify that the individual experience can be true or false. But I'm saying, is it possible that what we're doing and trying to recreate them artificially through experiment is something that might be why we're getting less verifiable results, if that makes sense? I'm trying to form the question on the fly too.
Yeah, it is. If you're going to say that we can't test the supernatural aspect of it, like in that way with the charts on the walls that people are seeing, I agree with that. I think it's too hard to know, because sometimes people say they're in the hospital, sometimes people say they're in heaven, sometimes they're outside the building. You can't know where they're going to be or what they focus on. But what I was saying is, I'm not worried about replicating the veridical part. I'm saying that if the natural hypothesis, if the non-supernatural hypothesis is correct, that should be able to be replicated, because that is mechanistic and false.
Okay, I see.
I'm just saying, if they're going to propose a naturalistic explanation, like, oh, it's false memory or it was whatever, a mechanism in the brain, we should be able to replicate that. And if we can't replicate that, then that would at least rule out that naturalistic explanation. So at best, you can eliminate like all plausible naturalistic explanations and make an inference to the supernatural. But I agree with you that I don't think we can necessarily replicate the supernatural itself. That's going to have to sort of be on a case-by-case basis.
Unless people are lining up to be willing to participate in a near-death experience, saying, we're going to kill you almost. Like, I just don't see people lining up for that. But no, I actually agree with Caleb on this one, to be 100% honest. With that being said, Dale, I don't think I think Caleb explained that pretty well. We'll go to you, brother, and see what you have to say about that. Or do you want to play your clip now?
Yes, okay.
I'm going to get this, Nat, I swear. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but if you see me I swear I'm not having a near-death experience. Like, I'm trying to get this, Nat. And by the way, for our audience, please give the like button a near-death experience. I think I got it. By clicking and smashing and just beating the like button, black and blue, if you are enjoying this conversation. So go ahead.
Mr. Ball in there.
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
The like button.
I don't think I've ever heard him say give the like button a near-death experience, but he plays a lot of pranks on the like button, and so yeah, I'm being inspired from him, if not directly copying him. So yeah, you're right. I'll admit that one.
So okay, so I guess three points that I want to make then. I guess if I'm responding to Josh's again, I pretty much agree with Caleb.
There you go, Dale.
Yeah, I mean we are able, for example, in shroud studies, Bob Rucker makes this huge mistake by saying, "Oh, miracles are untestable or unfalsifiable." Complete rubbish. No, because if a miracle takes place and then the natural world takes over, we can assess it and falsify. Okay, if a burst of radiation happened, we would know the laws of nature would take over and we would observe X, Y, and Z. Do we observe this or not? So they can be testable, and falsifiable in that way. And or as Caleb said, we can, if we're assuming a natural mechanism, then we can rule that out and falsify those theories and stuff. No, one thing I would just, again, I agreed with Josh's point about the spiritual world. I don't think that God is following a formula. It would be foolish to be like, oh, well, I'm going to get a miracle. All I have to do is go to Lourdes, say the prayer, and I'm guaranteed to get healed. That's not how that works. It's not.
Right.
Yeah, that would be magic or incantation of some kind. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's the same with the NDEs. So that's why there's those problems. But I would say that our God is a God of law and order. And even in the spiritual world, there has to be regularities for creatures. They're not necessarily the laws of nature, but there has to be some kind of rules for us to make sense and to exist, for understanding each other. If there's going to be talking, okay, there has to be rules of language, stuff like that. The laws of logic will be present and stuff. So there has to be something. It's not going to be chaos. It can't just be chaos. Now, on to the 2 points that I wanted to make. So in terms of the out-of-body experiences, it's one of the key differences, and I have a quote from Dr. Bruce Grayson here, is that unlike the NDEs, there aren't these veridical aspects that are provable, that are accompanying the out-of-body experiences in the same way they do with the NDE. So I just want to play a quick clip from my show with Bruce Grayson talking about that difference here.
These researchers who induce out-of-body experiences by stimulating parts of the brain, usually the right temporal lobe, are not actually inducing out-of-body experiences. They're inducing illusions that are similar to out-of-body experiences, but actually are very different. In a spontaneous out-of-body experience, such as in an NDE, the person perceives themselves as existing out of there and looking down on their physical bodies. And they can move around and think and feel from that out-of-body perspective. In the out-of-body experiences, quotes, that are induced by electrical stimulation, the research participant experiences himself as being in the body and seeing the external body outside, which doesn't move around, is not an active participant. It's not at all the same thing. Also, in these induced experiences, you never hear a report of an accurate perception from an out-of-body perspective, which is common in a near-death experience.
So that's kind of a major difference between these kind of out-of-body experiences that are said to mimic the NDEs. They never come attached with these veridical aspects. And there are clear distinctions, right? You're not an active participant. You're just kind of frozen looking around or something like that. And the other thing I wanted to say in terms of some of these aspects, one of the reasons that Dr. Bruce Grayson gives, and I think it's a really powerful argument against natural theories and stuff, some kind of neuroanatomical or neurochemical explanation, whatever you want to do. We have cases where the brain is, either it's flatlined, but even when there's disputes, because Caleb rightly mentions in some cases there will be disputes, and I was lucky enough when I was doing my religious research, I worked with Keith Augustine, who was an atheist, and he is an expert on NDEs. He's written for infidels.org, and I spoke with him about some of these NDE cases and about resurrection appearances and stuff like that. So, but even if we grant, okay, let's say we can't prove it was a flatline brain state when this NDE took place, at the very least, we can prove concretely that the brain functions. How does Bruce put it? Hold on. Let me see his quote for a second. The neuroelectric conditions necessary for the conscious experiences in question were highly, highly diminished. But yet the conscious experiences being reported are the opposite. In some cases, they're even more vivid than just me watching you right now on StreamYard.
Right.
That mismatch is a powerful reason that speaks against, some kind of neuroanatomical or neurochemical explanation.
So the way I've heard it described, Dale, just to add to that point real quick, and Josh and Caleb, if you guys want to comment on this, feel free, but that the NDE is quote unquote more real than reality. And so there was a very interesting anecdote that Bruce gave in his book about a gentleman that committed suicide. So first of all, to give background, this gentleman was schizophrenic. And by the way, so just to add to that real quick, Bruce, and you guys comment on this if you want to as well, but Bruce did a study about the correlation between mental illness and those who have NDEs. And the conclusion was, without going into the details about it, there's really no correlation between mental illness and those who have NDEs. There is a absolute separation between the two, as a matter of fact, and it's not just people with mental illness that have NDEs. People of a right mind that we would classify as sane, they have NDEs. And again, just to reiterate Bruce's words, there's no correlation between mental illness and NDEs. But to that point, so there was a gentleman that had schizophrenia that stopped taking his medicine, and he said that he quote unquote heard the voice of Satan telling him to kill himself. But as he was, and he attempted to do that by jumping off this building, and you can read about this in the book after. But then he said while he was falling, he heard the voice of God say that he is more loved than he has ever known. He does not think, that he's worthless or anything that Satan has been putting in the back of his head. And while he was reiterating this concept and this near-death experience and the events that led up to this near-death experience to Bruce, the guy classified it like this. He said, I know that Satan's voice in my head was nothing more than an hallucination. And that led Bruce to say, okay, but the voice of God was real to you? And he said, let me describe it for you like this. I know now, thinking about this rationally, that because I stopped taking my meds, because the reason he gave for stop taking his meds is because he said that they made him feel tired and he didn't like that feeling. And I can get on board with that. I've took some prescription drugs before that just made me zombie, and I quit taking them. And luckily I didn't have a Satan enter my head and hallucinate or anything like that, but I get where this guy's coming from. And so I'm just saying that to say that I relate to it. But But the guy went on to describe to Bruce, he says, look, I know that Satan's voice was a hallucination because I stopped taking my meds. It was not as real to me, right? Now, whatever he means by that is something that's subjective, and I agree with that only he can describe for us, and it's something that we can't necessarily verify. I'm just laying out the story as it was told in the book after. But he said, and to compare that now to my conversation with you, Bruce, my conversation with God was quote unquote more real than my conversation with you. And this guy is lucid. He's awake in the hospital at this point. Bruce is coming on to check on him after, the fact. I don't know if he had surgery or not, but I know that Bruce waited a couple days after he was admitted to the hospital for jumping off a building, that he waited to talk to him. And so I find that interesting. So just saying what Dale, just to add to what Dale was saying, a lot of people describe these near-death experiences in terms of reality and say that it's more real than even the reality that we find ourselves in. And I'm sure, Josh, you've got a lot to say about that concept. So I'll turn it over to you, and then Dale and Caleb, if you guys want to comment on it, feel free after Josh.
Well, what I thought was really interesting is what Dale was explaining. The picture that was brought to my head was the difference between dreaming and waking, or perhaps even dreaming and a vision, right? Where a dream is something that you experience as a key player of the dream, but often one of the features of a dream is either being a spectator or being swept along by the feature of, let's call it the film, as it rolls on. You experience things as they happen, and you seem to be the recipient rather than the participant, like you said. And so it seems like to be more.
You're talking about, Josh, just to interrupt real quick. So are you talking about right now, like you're watching yourself kind of in your dream, or you're watching events transpire in your dream that's not necessarily happening to you?
Right. Well, or
okay.
Well, just in general, a dream, one of the features of being asleep and knowing you're dreaming, if you are able to actually bring yourself to the awareness.
Yeah, I've had that happen one time, bro, and it was trippy. So anyway.
The dream shifts itself in some real sense after you've been made aware that what you're doing is dreaming. And some people can go past that into something that we call lucid dreaming, where they're actually the active participant of their dream. They're having something else that they're experiencing. Most people don't experience that. So it's very rare, right?
One time. One of the main features of,
but so, I mean, I've talked to you about your dreams a lot of times. This is something of particular interest to me. So it's like the way that we experience dreams often is as a recipient rather than as the guiding participant of the dream. Whereas what it seems like in something more along the lines of a vision, at least as they're recorded in scripture, is that this person is like in their wits, well aware of what's happening, and seem to be experiencing these things as though they were in fact real, or what we mean by that usually is materially verifiable or something like that, something that has to do with our sense data immediately. But if this person is out of their body in that sense, and their body is the means by which we have that sense data, like I said earlier, it seems to be something that kind of hints, at least, if not kind of screams loudly, that our sense data might actually be a filtration system rather than the main means by which that we actually perceive. It seems to me, because of what you're saying, and the way, I forget the way that Dale phrased it, because I was listening as well, but it seems like what we're saying is that when you're removed from the filters of your body, you're kind of untethered from those senses, and they're seemingly able to like run wild of their own accord, and you have this more vivid experience, if that's what you want to call it, more lucid, whatever, it's more real. What we usually mean by real is sense data. That's usually what we even mean by real in the most like average colloquial everyday sense.
Can I comment?
You could touch it, you know?
Hey, Josh, can I comment on that just real quick? And then I'll let you get back to, I don't want to break your train of thought or anything.
No, you're good.
But so Bruce actually argues in the book that or not argues, I guess, gives stories about people and comes to the conclusion that maybe the brain is like this filter that is limiting us in a very
that's
real
pretty much
sense.
What I was saying. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So I found that interesting that you brought that up, and I just read about that in after. So
and full disclosure, I've never even heard of Bruce before today, and I don't know anything about this book.
Right.
So I'm just trailing along. So if he has a similar intuition, I feel like I'm in good company here, because
Yeah,
this
you
is
are.
something
I
that
think
we're
so.
talking about.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me like that's what that would in some sense need to be the case if you're going to, let's say, be untethered from your body and then still have perceptible experiences that aren't being filtered through your, neural activity and cognitive whatever, right? So all of these things, what I'm saying is, if it's almost the contrast from dreaming to waking, right? C.S. Lewis put it this way: those who are asleep don't understand waking. There's those who are awake that understand sleep, right? And so it seems to me like what you're saying is something very much along those lines. Is the experience of these people is that once they're untethered from that physical body, it seems like everything else is more itself rather than less itself, which is exactly the opposite. Like you said, seems like exactly the opposite of what should happen when you become untethered from your sense data, is that you should cease to have sense data.
Right.
You should not have any sight, any feeling, sensations, hearing. None of those things should be possible without the mechanism by which you have the sense data. And so if you still have sense data without the mechanism, something very weird is happening. And so I find that to be like the most compelling part of this, to be honest with you.
Yeah. No, I agree. Caleb, Dell, is there anything you guys want to add to that?
I'm the one who kind of started this, so I'm just happy to hear what Caleb has to say as well.
I don't have anything on that particular point. I will say, since you keep referencing Grayson's book, if we're doing book recommendations now, I think the most exhaustive one I've seen on this is called "The Self Does Not Die." It's published by several different European scientists, and it has how many pages? But 350 has like a lot of, these are all just near-death experiences, like verified by one witness, two doctor. It gives like a whole category of like kinds of near-death experience, and it goes after case by case. Basically, it surveys the literature. It's like, here's everyone we could find in every published one that had documentation or had like a witness or something like that, and not just a hearsay. And so it's pretty detailed. So I think that's a good one. Another one I'd recommend, since you're talking about sense perception while out of the body. I believe, no, hold on, it wasn't Grayson. It was Kenneth Ring. He's another big name in near-death experiences. He actually did a book, I think it was in the 90s, called Mindsight. And it's fairly well known because it was a book about near-death experiences, but he specifically focused on people who were born blind or went blind from a very young age. And he has cases where allegedly people, who are blind, when they're at near-death experiences, they can see things and accurately get details when they're out of their body. But when they go back in, they're blind again, right? But when they're out of their body, they can see things for the first time. So even though they were born blind. So it's like that kind of thing. I think it's a fairly well-known book. I'm presuming Dale knows about it, but
yeah, I forgot about it. But once you mentioned it, I'm like, yeah, that I remember those cases.
I know Keith Augustine makes a critique of it, but I mean that's just, it is an interesting book, regardless. I think another thing to turn to is I'm sorry, Tyler, go ahead if you're gonna.
No, I was just gonna ask. So Grayson mentions Raymond Moody, and if I remember correctly, he actually did an interview with him on the Audible version of the book. Have you heard anything about him particularly, or?
I know he's a big. So if you're doing big names in near-death experience, Grayson's big one. Kenneth Ring, Raymond Moody, Sam Peronia, who did the study that Dale was citing, the AWARE study.
Okay.
With the things on the top.
Isn't Moody the one who invented the term near-death experience?
He may have.
I think so.
He may have, yeah. And then you have Penny Sartori, who did the one that I mentioned in 2008. Melvin Morse, I think was one of the first ones. He was a child. I think it was like a pediatrician. He was the first one to sort of observe this in children. So those were sort of and then on the skeptical side, it would be, I think, Susan Blackmore and like Keith Augustine, who write a lot of the skeptical literature on that. So it is a fair crowd, but you do see a lot of that discussed. One thing I did want to, two things I want to bring up was one, given the overlap with sort of what I'm looking at and with near-death experiences, there are some cases, and I believe, I know I shared with you an article by Penny Sartori about one case where you'll have inexplicable healings sometimes that happen after, and it'll just be people recovering from consciousness, which sometimes does happen. but ones where, like the one I had sent you was of a patient who was in the hospital for some kind of cancer treatment. 60 years old. He'd been born with cerebral palsy, so he had a withered hand, basically, where it was atrophied and couldn't move it. It was very, withered. And they noted that when he went into it. After he gets out of the near-death experience, he talks about how he saw and he wasn't particularly religious, but he saw his deceased father, and he saw a man wearing white who he said kind of looked like Jesus, but didn't really wasn't sure what the connection was. But after he was released from the hospital a few days later, his hand was back to normal for the first time, and he usually had to wear a splint before that. And so doctors noted that. And when she'd asked the nurse and stuff like, did he have any kind of physical therapy for his hand? She's like, nope, we didn't record any kind of like that. But the muscle mass had returned after he had woken up. So that's one example. There are examples where people have had, there's one back in the 40s I think Dale knows Dr. Joe Bergeron. He wrote a book because he was close to the family about a case of Betty Baxter, who was a 16-year-old in the 1940s who was born with congenital scoliosis, where her spine was basically crooked in a severe way. It gets worse when you get older. So by the time she was a teenager, she could barely sit up. When she was in a chair, her head would basically be down in her lap, and really, really sad, constantly on morphine. But she'd had a near-death experience, and she didn't get healed after the near-death experience, but during the near-death experience, she had a vision. She saw heaven and Jesus told her she was going to be healed on a particular day. I think it was like August 3rd. I'm making this up, like August 30th, 1941 or something like that.
Right.
So on that day at 3 p.m., time exactly. So on that day, all the neighbors gathered and were praying for her. And then sure enough, at that time, she says that she could see Jesus coming to her. And he was in the vision, he was rubbing his hand against her back. And all the witnesses heard a cracking noise. And she was like sat up for the first time and lifted up the chair and was excited, running around. And newspapers reported this, a few days after this happened, and they interviewed some of her doctors, and they didn't have an explanation. So really strange stuff when that happens. So I don't know what the correlation there is between healing and near-death experiences. Sometimes there is one, but it is sort of an overlap with my area of interest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't know, and Dale, maybe you can comment on if you guys got into that correlation of healing. I don't remember if Bruce actually goes into like healing and near-death experience, the correlation between the two in the book after. But if you talked about that with him, I'd love to hear about it.
So I didn't talk about that with him in the interview that I did.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember because it's been so long, but so just if we're doing recommendations, the best book I've seen, if you want like a summary of the field, it's a bit dated now, but it's from like 2010, I think. But the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, which summarizes, you have that already, Tyler. But
I've heard of it. Yeah, I haven't looked at it yet.
So that's a really good go-to source, and it covers all of the different aspects, right? Like pleasurable NDEs, distressing NDEs. And it's written by a bunch of the scholars and stuff. And there's a chapter on non-Western NDEs and the differences, how the culture impacts and stuff like that. And from what I remember, there was an account of a healing, but I can't remember anything about it or something like that. But there was at least one account that I remember reading in that book. Mm-hmm. Another good place that might be helpful, Jeff Long, and he has a website called NDERF. I can actually show it to you guys, but he just collects online a bunch of accounts. Now he doesn't necessarily always screen them and stuff like that, so you'll get a lot of anecdotes, but he does have certain, in terms of the updates, it looks like he has exceptional NDEs where he goes into that, and obviously, so yeah, he may. Okay, yeah. So basically, this is just kind of a list of a catalog of all the NDE tales that are out there, and people can contribute to it and stuff. So, again, it's a popular level source, but like it's got a lot of anecdotal evidence that you can go to. So, yeah.
I feel like the addition of what Caleb was talking about just a moment ago, because he had mentioned cases in which this experience happened to a child. I would be particularly interested in finding out what the data is on the let's say, level of vividness or reality of a thing for a child who becomes untethered from their body and has these, like, you know, unfettered experience, because it's just weird. Like, the entire thing to me is kind of like, I feel my brain going like this, you know, I feel like I'm getting older. That's a Paralandra reference for those who get it. But I feel like I'm trying to think about what it would be like to be disembodied, but the only experience I have is by means of my body. And so it's weird to try to imagine this, but children are often in a place to be a little bit more sensitive to things of this regard in general. And so I feel like it would be interesting to, I don't know if any of you guys have read anything on that particularly, what the experience of children.
I think Melvin Moore specifically did a book or an article on that, because I think he's a pediatrician or like a child psychologist to my knowledge. So I know there's a particularly famous one he did involving a girl who had drowned, and this is actually the one that got him, I think, involved. She had drowned and she had returned, and they were able to resuscitate her. Surprisingly, she came back, and she went into this long detail about how she had seen an angel named Elizabeth, and the angel took her hand and showed her where her parents were. And, her mom was, when they had gotten the call that she had drowned and was basically dead, her brother was playing with a certain truck. Her mom was cooking chicken and rice. Her dad was listening to his favorite song, et cetera, et cetera. And she described this in great detail. And she also described like an OBE during the hospital room. And the doctor was really surprised. He was writing all this down. So he calls the family and they come and they're like, "Oh, where's my little girl?" They're so excited. And he interviews them and he asks them like, "Yeah, so what were you doing?" All this stuff. And, it matched up what they say. It's like, what were you cooking? "Oh, I was cooking a chicken and rice and all." And so allegedly she saw from miles away what her family was doing at the time while she was brain dead. And that's what got him to, when an angel was allegedly showing her these things, got him interested in that subject. I also, to my knowledge, I think he was convicted of crimes of Morris was. So I don't know. I'd have to double check that. Someone had brought that up to me recently. So I don't know how credible he is, but I think as a doctor, he's generally accepted. I don't want to do an ad hominem, but I saw that as an objection that an atheist had raised when someone raised one of those cases. Like, well, the guy was convicted for some kind of other crime. So I don't know. Take that with a grain of salt.
I think the girl's name was Katie, if I'm not mistaken.
It might have been a pseudonym, but yeah.
A pseudonym. Okay, yeah. And I think she was the one, if I'm not mistaken, she was the one that actually saw the number on the top of the ambulance or something as well. So yeah, like that was another one of those confirmed details that was taken down. But yeah, that's one of Gary's favorite cases, Katie in the swimming pool. So yeah.
Yeah. So if we're going to get to, there's two more things I want to talk about before I don't want to hijack that, but I do want to talk about a little bit about possible scenarios to explain it that a skeptic could say. And then I look a little bit theologically about how we view this, because I have some reservations there as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
But when it comes to scenarios, when it comes to the veridical ones, the reason I have skepticism is because I feel like a lot of these, they're not in controlled environments. So, and I understand that you have confirmations, but I think the worry I have with confirmations is how accurate they actually are, because memory is often unreliable, right? And we sometimes have cryptomnesia, where we remember things and we think that we didn't know them when we did. And so I wonder how much of this is done with accidentally with leading questions, right? Just like you see psychics and mediums do a lot. And if you talk to a believer, they'll say, "Oh, they knew." It's like if I talk to a woman and she's like, "Oh," he asked her, "Does the date August 15th mean anything to you?" "Yes, that's my husband's birthday." She's going to go and tell her friends, "I went there and he told me my husband's birthday like that. There's no way he could have known that." When the question wasn't your husband, he didn't say your husband's birthday. He said, "Does that mean anything to you?" And she filled in blanks, right? So my worry is that in some of these cases, do you have it to where it's like, "Oh, I was floating my body and all that stuff. That's amazing. Did you see me doing that?" "Yeah, I think I did see you doing that." "Oh my gosh, she saw us doing that." Can you if it's, and it's not even like a lying thing, but I think some people can misremember things where if a doctor asks leading questions, or, you wake up and it's like, "Oh, what's up with that doctor? Oh, he flaps his arms a lot and all this stuff." And then he later on, as he's recovering, thinks he remembers seeing that. Again, these are very speculative, but we know that stuff like that can happen with other instances. So I think it's hard to rule those out in some cases, unless you can show that there was absolutely no way they contacted anyone and that the details were accurate. That I think what you'd have to do is you'd have to have the event be written down and recorded by someone independently, and then have someone verify it without interacting with them. Like if, you know, like if someone's like, okay, she went to her house and wrote down on a notepad, the school bus is yellow at her home. And then she comes and tells her, oh, I saw you write that down. And then she goes and grabs it and says, yep, this is what I wrote. Can you believe that? Or something like that. Because I think in memory, I am kind of hesitant to trust in those kinds of signatures. So I think that's a plausible natural explanation for a lot of these cases if I was going to play skeptic.
See, and to that point, Caleb, I like what Bruce, really does in his book After, and that is, now granted, again, he's the one writing the story, and he's the one that had his, his interactions with these people. And so we're only getting what he decided to put in his book, obviously. But from the way he laid it out is that he asked them basically 3 questions. A person that has been confirmed, so to say, to have a near-death experience is that, what do you remember before? What do you remember after? And then what do you remember during? And then after they lay out the during, specifically, because you mentioned the, the flapping the arms thing, from my understanding of Grayson's account anyway, is that they told that to him. So the person that had the near-death experience told that to him, and then Bruce went and verified that with the doctor and the surgeon that was performing the surgery, and he was like, he was all offensive about it at first, like, who'd they talk to, kind of like what you were saying. And apparently it was no one, but again, that's coming from, the psychiatrist that interviewed the person that wrote the book. So if he decides to leave out details or whatever, that's all on us, but, or that's all on him, I should say. But yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying there.
Yeah, and it's just hard to know. Like, I don't think that works for all the cases, but I think it's just hard to know either way. And Dale probably knows about this case. There's a really well-known one called Mary's Shoe, right? Where there's this Hispanic woman, I think back in the 70s, who's having near-death experience, and she sees herself above the hospital, and she sees on like the ledge that there's a shoe. It's like blue and it has like one of the aglets, that word, right? Damn, that like very specific description. So she wakes up and describing this, and she tells her that, like, and so the nurse goes and checks, and sure enough, there's this thing on there, right? It's amazing. I know Keith Augustine mentions some researchers who went to that hospital a couple of years after that, and they said that when they looked in the room that she had been admitted to, the shoe would have been visible from that ledge, and so it's like we can't know that she didn't see it before or after and had pieced that together in her mind or something. But basically, there's a way she could have. So when you're trusting details about like, oh, they could, no one's verified that, they would have been. Sometimes it's hard to know, right? Now I know that the nurse in that case disputed that, said, well, the hospital building's been changed and it actually wasn't that one. But then it's sort of just her word versus theirs, and I don't know. So it's kind of difficult to really know. So.
No, I hear you. And I definitely want to get into what you were thinking about theologically, and maybe we can shift the conversation to that aspect, because, for the last 30 minutes of this conversation anyway, because I see it going for 2 hours. We're at the 1 hour, 34 minutes, and this has flown by for me. So I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. But so I definitely want to get into like how the Orthodox, so now this is just a view that so to my understanding, Orthodox Christians kind of view death and what happens during and pretty much after death a little bit differently. There's some Christians that believe in what we would call a particular judgment, which I think all of us can really agree with that. Like, we will be judged in one way, shape, or form for the things that we did and that we didn't do on earth. And then, the final judgment. But to my understanding, Orthodox Christians have different ways of articulating that. And the book that I've been reading on that is Departure of the Souls. That is going to correlate to the image that I set as a thumbnail. And so I want to talk about that. But Caleb, I'll go ahead and let you, I know you said that you wanted to lay out a theological, and Dale, if you want to comment on this too. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask Caleb something. So I wanted to add just a quick question. But
yeah, go ahead.
I would also like, because some people say that Paul, the Apostle Paul, experienced an NDE in the Bible.
Oh, with his trip to heaven, the third heaven. Yeah,
Some people interpret that as, oh, he had a near-death experience. But yeah, if we're doing something else, never mind.
Go ahead and ask. Yeah,
maybe an OBE, because he says he doesn't know if he's out of his body. But if that's the case, I don't know if it would even be an out of body. He says whether I was in the body or not, I don't know. So
right,
it's hard to tell.
Just to comment on that, Dell, I don't personally think that was a near-death experience, but rather would align with Caleb. And Paul says, whether I was out of the body or in the body, I don't know. So he could have been taken up like Enoch was, for example, in the body. And Elijah, we have both biblical, testaments of that actually happening, and was sent back. Whereas Enoch and Elijah, from our understanding and from the scriptural records, was kept there. Or he could have had an out-of-body experience, or what John describes, for example, St. John in the Revelation, as being in the spirit. And so this is more like a vision than maybe an out-of-body experience. But the thing that really gets me is that what Caleb said, and Paul specifically uses the phrase, whether I was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. And so that makes me lean more toward an out-of-body experience rather than an in-the-spirit type. But maybe those two things and that time meant the same thing for those guys. I don't know. But Josh, I saw you unmute.
Well, I was going to say that I thought it was interesting also to kind of toss around the idea of because when you mentioned Paul possibly having a near-death experience and then having this thing that you're saying, oh, it might have been an out-of-body experience, actually contrasting that with John in the Revelation to say, I was taken up in the spirit, whatever that means. And then that seems to exclude his body from the experience, but he also was having sense data. So I feel like if one of them was having a near-death experience, it might have been John rather than Paul. But it's definitely a trip to kind of think about, because I hadn't been thinking about Paul in the third heaven as something like that. But I think you're right. It's interesting that he does include whether I was in or out of the body, as though that was already in his head as a possibility, and had to include that. It kind of makes me wonder if people were having similar experiences, or if any of the other apostles had experiences like that, where they did say, I was out of my body, something like that, because the addition of that information seems rather conspicuous. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. So
go ahead,
Caleb, because I know Caleb wanted to raise a theological question or something. So.
Yeah, you can go ahead real fast.
Oh, for me, well, yeah, like I said, I was kind of asking you guys. I tend to not think it was it's referring to an NDE and stuff, but yeah, like it is interesting and stuff. I've never gotten to the bottom of it and stuff, so that's why I just wanted to ask you guys, like, what do you guys think about it? Because I know that's something people have brought up and stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. Do you think we answered that, Dale?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And again, in terms of do we know 100%? I'll ask God. I'll ask God in the end. It's not right. Something keeping me up late at night, but it's just interesting. So yeah.
Right. If I die before you, I'll ask Paul, and then whenever you have an NDE, then I'll come back and physically or spiritually, I should say, escort you to heaven. I'll be your guide, and then we'll go from there. But and I'll let you know what he said.
I think I'm going to be going and speaking to Paul first. I've got at least a decade on you. I don't know.
Well, maybe, but you never know.
One here actually, because Caleb's young. Josh, are you the same age as Tyler? I have no idea how old.
I have no age. I'm Santa Claus.
Josh, yeah, he's immortal.
See, he'll be delivering presents. Yeah, so.
Presents and the presents. Yes,
that will be the gift he gives you. Is the message from St. Paul himself. So.
I just like the idea of Tyler being your Virgil. I think that's hilarious.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We'll make it work. So, all right, Caleb, do you want to transition to the theological aspect of this conversation?
Yeah. So I think you and Josh actually sort of alluded to this, but one of the concerns I sort of have when people see heaven and more rarely hell is that I don't really understand these to be present states. I don't think anyone is in hell currently. I think it's a future state, right? So when people say, "Oh, I saw my dead loved ones" and all this stuff, it seems kind of paradoxical to think that they're, with God in that kind of way, that it's not a future state. Now, I know that there's debate in terms of soul sleep or intermediate period. I can understand that, but I feel like when you're out of the body at that point, they describe it usually. Sometimes it's a light, but sometimes they describe. Oftentimes it's described in like bodily terms, right? And that might be the brain filling in. It's like I saw so and so, and they were wearing so and so, as if disembodied souls wear clothes, right?
Right.
So like it kind of these weird things, and so maybe you could say that's the brain mitigating that. And as someone who is very sympathetic to the apotheos, the Christian doctrine of apocaustis, the Christian universalism, right? Universal reconciliation.
Yeah.
I think it's very encouraging to see that most near-death experiences are very positive, and experiences of hell are very rare, even across different religions. But the ones about hell, I think, are interesting. And I do talk about one, and it'll be in one of the volumes of the book I'm doing, about a really interesting miracle resurrection case that I think is pretty well certified. And I'm convinced that the person really was dead and really came back from life. But they describe seeing both heaven and hell, and they use very literal language in terms of seeing, gates of hell and mansions in heaven. And the hell described by this individual is almost reminiscent of like Dante's Inferno. Like it's wicked people being burned and people gorging themselves on their own flesh and vomiting it back up and cyclically forever and ever, right? Very horrible torture methods that seem much more medieval than they do anywhere in the Bible. So there's a part of me that, and so I sort of have my own theological biases for just rejecting that as being highly unlikely. So I guess it's like how much of these experiences should inform our theology? How much of our theology should inform how we interpret this? And for those who say, I think rightly, that, well, look, a lot of this is interpretive through the mind of the person. This is why you have cultural differences and that stuff. I think that's plausible. But then my concern is to say that you're having very mixed messaging here. This person is dying. They're given this profound religious experience, and God allows them to experience something that's not accurate. If anything, that may reinforce their false beliefs in whatever religion they hold to, and sort of is almost deceitful in that way, because clearly that person is going to be convinced, probably beyond any way of them being unconvinced by it, right? If it's that profound experience, to say that, oh yeah, I probably was hallucinating, like they're going to be even more fervent believers than they were previously.
Right.
So it's like, by God, by allowing people to misremember it and to just sort of interpret it through this context where it could be miscommunicated, it's like, well, look, God is not limited by our fallible memory. It's not like I wanted to show so-and-so the afterlife, but I dropped the ball. Darn it, they misremembered. They shouldn't have interpreted that way. I wish I was more clear. Like, I don't think that's plausible. I think it's, if God wants to communicate this is the afterlife, he could be very much more less ambiguous about it. Right. So, like, if there is ambiguity there, why so?
Yeah.
That's the questions I'm asking.
That's awesome. And so I'm glad. So what we've said so far is kind of leading up to the climax, of this episode at this point right here. And so I'm thankful for Caleb for bringing this up now. And I know like Orthodox Christians would answer that. And I don't want to give all the information away at this point, because I'm actually going to do an episode here relatively soon. I'm not going to say it's going to be in the very, very near future, because we're going to bring him on with Father John Whiteford and Father Joseph Gleason to do an episode of why we ought to believe the consensus of the saints whenever it comes to dogma and doctrine. But then after that transpires, my subdeacon and I are going to do a show specifically about what Orthodox Christians, and this is what I was kind of alluding to earlier, what we call toll houses, or what others have identified as the particular judgment. And so if one wants to think of the toll houses as something more akin to what, and I know Protestants, Roman Catholics, and I think all, branches and aspects of Christendom would classify this. I think we all believe, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but we're all going to experience like this particular judgment where we, quote unquote, stand before God and are judged for the things that we've done here on the earth, whether good or bad. We know the Bible talks about this so often. Revelation, Matthew 25, 1 Corinthians describes this as, or it might be 2 Corinthians now that I'm thinking about it, but about our works being burnt up, or rather more like gold and silver and fine jewels whenever they're thrown into the fire, that they are refined and purified, and those things that we'll receive a reward for. So I think that we all have an understanding that we're going to be judged on the basis of our works, whether that's, entrance into heaven, or whether it's rewards for, whenever we get to heaven, it's the rewards that kind of separate us in a hierarchical kind of sense. Whatever we believe there, we all believe that we're going to experience this particular kind of judgment, right? And so the thing that I find the most interesting, and especially coming from Dr. Grayson's book, is that 86, and I'm pretty sure I'm getting this number right, but y'all can read the book and comment in the comments or the live chat if I'm wrong on this. But 86% of people have a good, and this is something I related to Caleb in our chat before this, but a good or a blissful experience. Now, this is like broad, like painting with a broad brush. So it doesn't matter if you're a Christian, it doesn't matter if you're an atheist, it doesn't matter if you're a Hindu, it doesn't matter whatever. 86% of people that reported to Dr. Grayson about having an NDE is reporting a good or blissful NDE, that some people are even mad whenever they're resurrected or revived that they're back. like some people go into depression because they did not want to leave. Other people have reported experiencing a choice that they were given to enter into eternal blackness. Now, this was from an atheist, so I think that this is more, or an agnostic, I should say. So this is more correlating with their, subjective experience and what their mind has kind of construed. And so he was said he could enter into eternal darkness, or he came back. But the thing that he elaborated on the most and emphasized the most is that he was given a choice. So given a choice by whom, right? That's the question. He chose to come back, obviously. I hear that, in listening to Dr. Grayson's book, a lot, that there were guides there. And this is where the thumbnail is getting at. So there are a lot of people also, those who report a negative. So I said that 86% of the people that report an NDE experience report blissful and a good experience. There are 7% of people that report a bad, or as Caleb was describing, like a hell type of experience. Now, I agree with Caleb on the aspect of hell. I don't think people are in the lake of fire right now. That's specifically talked about in Revelation. And if we look at Luke, it seems like people go to an intermediate state that is called Hades. If you're not going to heaven, so from an Orthodox perspective, if you don't pass the toll houses and make it to heaven, you're going to Hades to wait for whatever, a second judgment or whatever. And that's something we're going to go into more in depth whenever I bring my subdeacon on to, elaborate on those types of things. Well, if we're being, particularly judged now, why are we experiencing a second judgment later if we've already failed? Things like that. But 7% of people do report having a bad near-death experience. They seem to say it's either like a torturous thing, or like the thumbnail. So a story that I heard was there was this person in the hospital, and this was reported by a nurse, actually. So not even a person having a near-death experience, but a third party kind of looking in on this person that was screaming one night. She said, "Don't let the darkness take me." She was reported as saying, she sees like these dark figures standing around her, and trying to take her to some place that she did not want to go. Now, what's also interesting, too, just to kind of touch on Caleb's point, is that out of, I think Bruce Grayson said it's like 90% of the people that have a near-death experience, whether good or bad, it's a life-changing event. And so this is something that has literally changed the way, because a lot of people experience or report experiencing this, what's called a life review, and they see just the nasty kind of things that they've done, not only from their perspective, but from the person that they was doing it to. And that's a wild trip in and of itself. I couldn't imagine doing that. But it's so, quote unquote, real, but so affecting to these people that they actually come out of this near-death experience, change their life, and then Bruce follows up with them years down the road and is happy to report that they're still, going on in the way that they have, decided to act now after the NDE rather than before. So we've got, in the book, he specifically describes a mafia member that totally gave up, the gang life in the mafia, that he is, all about love now and trying to do. He actually made phone calls to people that he had done wrong in the past, asked for their forgiveness, just different things like that, like trip me out. And so coming at this from a Christian perspective now, to get to the final point, and then I'll bring it on to Dale and Josh to get what you guys have to say about this as well. But for me, the thing that stood out to me about Bruce Grayson's book was that there were some people who had been raised Christian, so Protestant, Roman Catholic. He didn't mention any Eastern Orthodox, but I would assume there is some that would fall into this category, that has experienced like pagan gods and goddesses in their near-death experience. Now, these are people that have grown up believing that Jesus is God, that there's only one God, and yet they experience something completely different in the NDE. On the flip side of that token, you have atheists and agnostics say they experience, quote unquote, Jesus and God. And so obviously we're not saying that these people are theologians by any stretch of the imagination, but to me, that sounds like at least a Binitarian version of God, right? And if not, the Holy Spirit is thrown into that mix with some of these reports as well. And so to kind of go back to what Dale was saying super early in this episode, there are people, yes, that do experience an NDE the way that they've been brought up, right? So a Christian will experience a Christian version of an NDE. A Hindu will experience, Krishna or Brahma or whatever. But then you have total opposite effects as well, as like what I stated earlier. Christian will experience a pagan god or goddess, and an atheist will experience Jesus or the Father, right? Or God just in general. So I find that extremely fascinating. To bring this then to a practical perspective, and if anybody's interested for an Orthodox view on the quote-unquote departure of the soul, there's actually a book on YouTube right now for free that's called The Departure of the Soul, and it goes through and lists all the accounts that we have in church history about different saints, different Greek fathers that have had this experience, right? That or that know somebody. So nobody brought up in the chat the experience of Theodora and her trip through the toll houses. That I think it was either Saint Gregory of Nyssa or Saint Gregory Nazianzus. So Saint Basil the Great, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and Saint Gregory Nazianzus are all three Cappadocian fathers. They're extremely close with each other, and I forget who St. Basil's little brother is, whether it's Gregory of Nyssa or Gregory Nazianzus, but it's one of them, so just bear with me on that. But with that being said, they give this explanation that St. Theodora went through these quote-unquote toll houses that seems to line up with what people have been describing that have a negative experience, that there are demons or there are shadow people or that there are dark evil entities there that are waiting to drag them to hell. And in the Departure of the Soul book, that's exactly what is described. Once you are going through these quote-unquote toll houses, you have demons there that are accusing you, that are just looking for a reason to drag you to hell, or Hades, I should say. And that, to me, is a very, very interesting correlation that I would love to explore more. But I asked my subdeacon about this the other day, and to wrap this up here and at this point, is that it seems like to him, and what other Orthodox Christians would say, is that if somebody is experiencing a blissful, good, quote, NDE, like this euphoric type of NDE, that doesn't have anything to do with Jesus or with God the Father or the Trinity or the Holy Spirit, it's a deception. But I think that you, Caleb, raise a good point at that point to say, well, then why would God allow, a loving God that is trying to save as many people as he can? I know you're a universalist, and that will save as many people as he can, kind of from your perspective. well, then why is he allowing people to experience this in the first place? Why not just kind of butt in and say, hey, look, no, that's not right. This is right. No one comes to the Father but through Jesus. This is what Jesus said in John, and that's it. So why allow this to begin with, which is a question I have. So Josh, I will, and Dale, I'll turn that over to you guys, and Caleb, if you want to comment. I know I was really long-winded on that aspect, but like I said, this is kind of the pinnacle of the conversation that I wanted to get to. So with that being said, guys, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Just so I know, you can't
Yeah, go ahead, Dale.
use the term toll houses. Is this some like Orthodox terminology, or is this?
Correct.
I've never heard what. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is something okay.
Yeah. You can, and for anybody that's interested that wants to do like a study on this, just real quick, or watch a video on it. So Craig Trulia and Father John Whiteford did an episode on the quote unquote toll houses, and you can find that on Craig's channel, Orthodox Christian Theology, and that's on YouTube for free for anybody that's interested.
Gotcha. Okay, so here's my answer. No appeals to toll houses or something. Right?
Yeah,
So,
fair enough.
I think it's something that I mentioned early that we have to be responsible, right? In the first place, we do know these are near-death experiences, not death experiences. We're not experiencing the afterlife, either
Right.
the end state or the intermediate state. And obviously, we can tell, right? From a Christian perspective, 7% of people going to hell is just wrong, because I think it's going to be the vast majority of humanity that will be damned. I think
The road that leads to destruction is wide. The gate. What? How does it go?
Yeah, narrow is the gate the path that leads to life.
There you go.
Wide, yeah. The wide path leads to damnation and stuff like that. So,
Right.
So just right there, it's important to know we have ways of being able to tell that these experiences are not necessarily indicative of the afterlife, and we're responsible to know that, right, to some extent. So it's not the case that God is allowing as much deception as you may have in mind. Now, to Caleb's question, but he's still allowing them to have these experiences that maybe of a Hindu god, or maybe of something that's not exactly Christian kosher, I guess, right? Why would he allow something like that? So one answer that I've heard in the literature is that he doesn't have a choice. It's necessarily the case when you're in an NDE state, your experiences will be filtered. And some NDE experts have said, even if you're experiencing the proper thing unfiltered while your soul's separated from your body, once it reconnects, it's filtered through your brain. So you're misremembering what you saw in a way. It's filtered through your cultural lens. So that's one answer. Another answer is saying, okay, let's say you actually are experiencing these things that don't correspond to the way the afterlife is. Why would God allow that? And the way I see that, this is the answer that I actually go for, is that I think that it's, again, because God in his providence is providing people with the experiences that they need. He's not necessarily authenticating, hey, this is the way the afterlife is. That's a false assumption that we're making after the fact. And it's kind of Caleb, you're a Christian too, right? Are you going to blame God and say, hey, it's what atheists call the deceptive concealment argument? And we talked about this on an open mic. Are you going to say, well, look, the parables say that people in heaven and hell can talk to each other, and it's possible for them to dip their fingers in and give a little drop of water? No, that God isn't being deceptive about the nature of heaven and hell, even though those elements aren't true. He's giving the parable to make a point. And I think that's what the NDEs are doing. It's for a point, and it's designed to appeal to those individuals that are having it. And God knows in his providence what will accomplish his will in giving that specific experience to those people. But just to kind of last thing I want to say on this concealment, deceptive concealment thing, just to think about it, right? Caleb, I take it you would agree with my point about the parables, but also atheists and skeptics. For example, I use the example of starlight, right? So God is so deceptive. Why? Because human beings for thousands of years have believed that the stars were as they appeared today, right? You see the starlight. I see the book with my eyes. That's as it exists today. I'm seeing the stars. That's how they must exist today. But we know scientifically that actually it's taken billions of years for that light to reach my eyeballs here on Earth. So I'm actually seeing the past. I'm seeing the star as it looked billions of years ago. Does that mean God's a deceptive liar? Is he deceptively concealing the truth from me? I think that you would agree, no, that it's the human. We've made this false assumption, this hasty assumption. And it's the same here with the NDEs. God has given us enough clues and indicators, number one, from just the contradictory nature of the reports, even from other seemingly credible accounts, and stuff like that. And the fact that we were near death, not actually dead, because we came back. I think that, I don't think that God is being unduly confusing. If we sat down and thought critically, I think we could come to the conclusion, at the very least, we would say, look, I have no idea what the afterlife is like, but I did have this experience, and I'm going to dwell on what was the point. What does God want me to get from this, or something? Does that make sense, Caleb, or talking nonsense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first part I would sort of write off as a little ad hoc, the idea that like we have no choice but to filter through that, as if, God can't give memories in a certain way, or that God couldn't simply, it's almost as if the soul is like getting untethered and God can't stop, because most people don't have near-death experiences, right? So as if God is powerless to stop, oh, that one's floating up, oh, he's out, God could make no one have a near-death experience if he really wanted to, I presume, in that way. But I think your second point was stronger to that degree. I don't think that starlight would be deceptive, because I think scientific discovery is inherently a good thing. And so God is basically putting us in an environment saying, go figure it out for yourself. And we are able to learn lots of things about creation, which is great. I feel like things within religious contexts that are sort of revelatory or taken as revelatory are a different category than that, where it's us just discovering things, where something that seems like it's explicitly involving God or some supernatural being appearing with a message, that's much more significant. What was that?
Oh, I was just wondering. So, like, what about the parable? Is God deceiving us about the nature of hell? Because obviously, the Lazarus parable that's not a true depiction of what hell would be like. So.
Yeah, but I think the context that it's a parable is different than it being an experience. Now, if Lazarus came back and, like in John, when he was raised from the dead, and said, "Hey, this is what I saw," I would presume that's meant to be taken, relatively seriously in that way. And plus, there's no consistent version of hell, or in that, sometimes it's a fire, like in that parable, but sometimes it's just a party where you're locked out and you don't get in. Sometimes it's just you miss the bridegroom, and there's weeping, gnashing teeth. It's different. Sometimes it's dark, but it's also fiery. There's a bunch of sort of just different imagery being used, I think, to just get to the point. But I think it's different than an experience, especially when it's at least the Christian concept of hell. But I just am worried that with people who are not Christians, and this may be less bad for me as a universalist, but if you believe that, in eternal damnation, for people to, let's say like a Hindu or a Muslim who experiences what they perceive to be their own religious orientation while going through a near-death experience, is that not going to be a bigger motivator for them to keep following the 5 pillars or to keep praying to Krishna or however they do it? That's proof for them that's such a real experience that's going to be more powerful than almost any argument. It'd be very hard to think of a defeater for them personally in that degree. So yeah, I think it's just very difficult to assess that. But I think the best I could say is maybe that God wants to lay down a foundation where, as Tyler pointed out, most people who experience these are spiritually changed for the better and get much more involved in spirituality and religion. So maybe God is using this as an open gate to have people come closer to him in general. But if they never end up coming to Christ, or it only makes them more fervent in the wrong spirituality, then I think that would be sort of problematic from what I can tell.
Last follow-up, because I know Josh has to speak and he's probably getting angry at me because he's got to have a say. But
Not at all.
I've never seen Josh angry. Like, I don't think.
You don't want to.
No.
Okay, so Caleb, and what about just piggybacking off of Tyler's response there? What about if it's not even, okay, so we're getting the person that had the experiencer to a certain point, but maybe the NDE is as it is to help others come to Christ, because, okay, maybe this guy has an NDE, sees Hindu gods, but he becomes a better person because of that, he impacts someone else and in such a way that they eventually come to Christ. Like that, maybe that's the reason why he had an NDE. Just piggybacking off Tyler's answer, you don't seem convinced. I can tell, but
I mean, maybe. I mean, that's plausible, but at that point, I don't see why that would be like. Why not just have also the person who experienced it come to be given? Like, imagine we lived in a world where everyone had a near-death experience. It doesn't have to be every person who dies, but of those who have near-death experiences, 90% or more, regardless of culture or religion, always saw Jesus or Mary or figures. That would be amazing. That would be really, really hard to explain naturalistically. And you see Christians do this with, Muslims having visions of Jesus despite not allegedly having any contact with Christians or minimal contact. So I think if you had something like that where everyone was having consistent things, that would be really phenomenal and be presumably a great evangelism tool. But I understand that there's divine hiddenness considerations and all this stuff. So my point being, I think it's very difficult to even try to assess God's motives for these, and that's why I don't think we can really come up with a model for explanation, and I'm very skeptical. But I'm generally just very antagonistic towards skeptical theist scenarios where it's like, well, maybe there's some unsung good down the line. I think that opens up a can of worms that I don't really want to go down, because that could have other issues. So yeah, if you want to be Mysterian about it, I think that's fine. But I do think that's an issue with model predictions. I don't think that under the Christian theism model, you would expect to see such divergent experiences. Whether you can account for that on the model is fine, but I do think it would at least be some evidence in question against the legitimacy of the experiences, or at least in evidence for Christianity. So that's just how I see it.
Josh?
Well, I don't think that people having a diverse span of experiences is a mark against Christianity, because there's a rather broad scope of spiritual experience that has nothing to do with near-death experiences at all. In fact, you can have people who have experiences on hallucinogens. You can have people that have experiences during deep cycles of meditation, or things like that. There was Christian mystics early on who had experiences, and one of the things that is kind of a universal of the experience is that these people seem to be aware that whatever's happening isn't something that is part of their normal gamut of experience. Like, they know it's something that's distinct, right? And I think it's actually a mark in favor of something that is not naturalism, at least, to say that these spiritual experiences being something that's a kind of rather universal thing that isn't confined to one particular culture or one particular region or one particular faith or anything like that, that this kind of has a broad scope, I think is actually a mark in favor of its being a more real thing. Because if everybody was just reporting the same thing, it would be far easier for people to just fabricate an experience and say, oh, I saw the same thing as old so-and-so over here, right? And so I think that the fact that they're markedly as individual as the people that are experiencing them is actually a mark in favor of them being more reliable rather than less reliable. But I'm kind of, I don't want to say weirded out, but I'm intrigued by the idea that people who grew up in a Christian worldview are seeing, let's say you called it pagan gods or something of that sort. I'm not entirely sure how that's distinguishable from the experience of perhaps an angel as a lowercase g god. Perhaps it's just some of the intuitive imagery that we've inherited, because it seems like, before there were explicit texts written about this or that god, that there was at least a common shared conception visually of some of the traits that would demarcate them, right? And so, like, before we had a sculpture of Ares, right? Then somebody made a sculpture or a painting or whatever. They derived the image that they're putting down or making from something, right? And then the other people that see it either have to be told or are able to recognize it as such. One of the things that kind of draws my attention to is actually maybe not a near-death experience, but something that's always been odd to me, is that on the Mount of Transfiguration, Peter and John and James don't have to be introduced to Elijah and Moses. They seem to be able to recognize these figures, though they're thousands of years apart in actual time. They've never met each other. It's absurd. They don't have any photographs. There's no video evidence. There's no way for them to know Moses and Elijah distinctly. They know Christ because he's been with them for, the entire ministry. But these other two, they seem to be able to recognize almost off top. So there seems to be something that kind of like I think there's an environment, and this is kind of something to do with maybe more speculation than anything else, but I think there's perhaps an environment of mind that these things can kind of develop in. And it's like over time, people have like this commonality, but also the individualness of their experiences, and kind of the combination of those two things. Like if this person leaves their body and becomes untethered, like we said before, and merely enters this environment of mind, let's say, perhaps that environment is actually shared more like a spider web than it is like a room, right? That there are things that extend out into other people's experiences that don't actually have to be communicated in the same way, that they seem to have these universal experiences that are connected to intuitions. And when we try to explain them imagistically, we have to latch them onto something. And as humans, our first mode of understanding or learning is by contrast or comparison. And so it seems naturally to lend itself to say, it's like this, it's like that. You know what I mean? The same way that, Dale, you mentioned parables. It's like the parables are similitudes. The kingdom of heaven is like ... And then he makes these comparisons. And, maybe people see the imagery of the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, and they immediately conflate this with heaven and hell, when in fact he's trying to describe Sheol, because heaven and hell weren't actually the developed understanding that we have now, 2,000 years later. This entire scope of imagery that we've inherited throughout history, they were in a different position. And so it's kind of interesting that we do inherit the imagery that we've been exposed to, but in some sense, even if I had never seen the image of one God or another, perhaps in some sort of experience like that, I have an experience where I witness a deity or whatever thing, and then I try to explain it to someone else, and they say, oh, it's like this, and then the association is made. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that it has to be anything that's a negative mark. I think it's kind of just a feature of human perception to have the individual and the shared collective together. And if that's what we have in material reality, perhaps there's an environment of mind where something similar happens. Again, I'm speculating, but that's kind of what it like brought to mind for me. Is maybe that's too sci-fi for some, but I think that it makes sense.
Here, I got to step in and say something stupid, but while you were talking there, Josh, I got a little bit nervous because I saw Caleb pick up some scissors, and I'm like, is he going to be be to have an NDE here?
Oh, no.
The scissors
I'm just playing with the stuff. I had a pin earlier. I'm just playing with stuff.
Okay, we don't need to do an experiment. No, it's okay.
Man.
I think it's interesting that, Josh, that you brought that up, because that was one of the things. And then I think we'll wrap with this at this point, because we're at the 2-hour, 13-minute mark, and I know you guys got to run. But with the idea of trying to explain something. So say somebody has an NDE, they actually see some things, because I truly, like, don't get me wrong, guys, I believe that there are people, at least one of these people, so we'll say the 1%, have actually had an experience, right? And so they're coming back from this experience and trying to explain maybe something divine in human terms, right? And we all, and for anybody that's watched this show on any regular basis, know that Dale has a vocabulary that I don't have. You have a vocabulary that I don't have. I have a vocabulary that you guys don't have. And Caleb is just all off in his own space somewhere. No, I'm just kidding, Caleb. I love you. But the point is that, we all have this different vocabulary that we use, and different metaphors that we would use to explain something. Josh and I, in trying to explain and having talks about Calvinism and non-Calvinism with each other.
Oh, man.
I can't say the amount of times that we've used metaphorical language to describe the same event, but in different metaphors, right? And so that makes sense what you were saying. And then I'll just wrap with this. I think, people that are experiencing these, and like I said, even Bruce goes into this, that there are some people that like straight up say, I can't explain this to you because there is not a word for it. The vocabulary of humanity at this point, no matter what language you're speaking, it's limited to what I experienced. And so people are trying to do the best they can. There's some people that leave it at that and say, look, bro, I just can't explain it to you. But then there's people that try, and they use metaphors like streets of gold, mansions, for example, hellfire and brimstone for another example, the opposite end of that spectrum. And honestly, like, I think the people that actually experience these things are just trying to do the best they can while experiencing them. So if they're saying something like, well, I experienced Brahma instead of Jesus, maybe you're right, Josh. Maybe they are experiencing this type of angelic entity that, for whatever reasons, presented themselves as Brahma. The thing I find the most interesting about this entire conversation is whether or not the person is, like the thumbnail, experiencing demons or entity, like dark entities or shadow figures, or if they're having a blissful experience, they are experiencing something, right? Now that's I think that is, unless they're just lying about it, which I would have to believe there are as at least one person that is lying about their experience, right? Maybe not, but I've ran into a bunch of liars, and I'm one of them, to be perfectly honest with everybody. I've done my share of lying in the past, and so
No.
I know, right? It's crazy
Why
to
should
believe
we
that.
believe that you're a liar?
Why should we believe it? That's right. That's
statement.
you're absolutely right, Caleb. If I've lied about one thing, that should question everything then, right? Like, y'all should question everything that I say. But no, to that point, like I said, I think that, there are definite experiences happening. I do think personally, like, I kind of like line myself up with Bruce Grayson, and I think that he's come to the conclusion, and Dale or Caleb, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, that coming from a skeptic, and don't get me wrong, like, he's still a skeptic, he still asks questions about what it is that people are seeing and experiencing. But I definitely think, from his book anyway, it just seemed like to me that he definitely believes in more than just this materialistic realm. That now, whatever, however he identifies substance dualism, panpsychism, whatever, right? There's something else other than the material that we sense with our eyes, nose, mouth, ears, and touch and feel. And so, with that being said, I think that these experiences are very, very interesting, and something that I want to get more books on and learn about more. And hopefully we can have Dr. Grayson on. Like, I know Dell said that he's in contact with him, or was anyway. And if he doesn't answer my email, I did send out an email to him to see if he would be interested in coming on our show to discuss these types of things. But it's definitely an eye-opener for me regardless. And to hear so many people experience these things, for me personally, and I'll end with this, and then we'll go on to Josh, Dale and Caleb, is that it really strengthens my faith in God, in the Christian God, because of what other people are saying, that, look, guys, death isn't the end. There is something else out there, and I got a little taste of that. That's what all of these NDEs have in common, from my understanding. So with that being said, Josh, I'll turn it over to you at this point to give a last word. Then we'll go to Caleb. Then we'll end with Dale, and I will wrap us up. I do have an announcement to make at the end. So if y'all are watching right now, please wait until the very end. We at Faith Unaltered need your help. And so with that being said, I'll turn it over to Dale. I see that you want to jump in real quick.
Josh, go first in terms of
Okay.
the announcement, but I just had a quick question for you. If you would want, because you've already contacted Bruce Grayson.
For me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's say he gets in contact. I'll wait, and if he gets in contact with you to come on the show, would you be interested? Because I also have connections with the atheist Keith Augustine. Now, it's been years. Like, the last time I talked to him was before I was Christian. Like, I think a year before I was a Christian.
Yeah.
But would you be interested, if both parties are interested? Maybe we could have a debate or a discussion, because that's something you don't see all the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dude.
Definitely.
Cool.
Let's talk more about that after, but yeah, definitely.
Cool. Yeah.
Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I have to agree with you, Tyler. it doesn't feel like I just spent 2.5 hours sitting here talking about this. But boy, I can see the counter, and I don't think it's lying to me, but I don't feel like I've been sitting here that long. This was really engaging.
Yeah.
I hope the people that are watching are enjoying it as much as we are, but I have to say I'm pleased. And I think that if we were to revisit this topic, I think it would be interesting to talk more about the dichotomy between good or bad experiences in near-death experiences, as well as perhaps talk about some of the things that have happened in association with hallucinogens, when people have positive experiences and then see real life changes in perhaps their behavior or their habits. I've read about people who had one positive experience on hallucinogens, like a psilocybin mushroom, and then all of a sudden they're able to quit smoking cold turkey like the next day and have no problem and never touch a cigarette again. It seems really weird, but the fact that these things kind of seem to be, the experience actually has real life bearing on what their lived experiences afterward, seems to be like the staying power of it, I think would be a really interesting thing to talk about as well. But as far as closing thoughts, I really enjoyed this. I thought this was really cool, and I would be totally juiced to get a debate going between somebody who is a believer and a skeptic in this topic, and especially be able to talk to a scholar who has spent the time and is a clinician who has access to the medical sciences and knows about human cognition and all that, to talk about these things. That would be so fantastic. And thankfully this episode for me was kind of a boost, because not tomorrow, but next Saturday, I'm going to be doing the next Cosmic Corner episode, and we're going to be talking about identity and the image of God. And we're going to be talking about humanity as a composite creature, that we're not a body with a soul or a soul with a body. We are a soul and a body. And so I think that this kind of is a nice springboard for me to keep the wheels turning. So I'm really enjoying this. And if anybody likes this kind of topic, should come check out Cosmic Corner on June 1st.
Josh, just real quick before we go to Caleb and then Dale, you should be you should feel very, very privileged, because Cosmic Corner was the first episode that was released on the Proof Text podcast from all of Faith Unaltered. It was a Cosmic Corner episode. What is the spirit, or what is a spirit?
Yeah,
that was the first. So for those that don't know, real quick, just a quick announcement. So Faith Unaltered is now on Spotify and Amazon Music, I think it is, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and then a list. I will get more info, but we're being hosted by a gentleman named Michael Halcomb, and he runs the channel on YouTube, Glossa House TV, and then on Spotify and all the podcasting platforms, it's called Prove Text, ProveText. So kind of like a play on proof text, but it's Prove Text. So if you like podcasts and you want more Faith Unaltered on podcast format, then you just search Prove Text in Spotify or your favorite podcasting platforms, and we will be there. So I'm excited to announce that. But Caleb, go ahead for closing thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to Dale.
I just enjoyed being on here. Thank you for inviting me. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I have always found this topic to be interesting, not just because of the paranormal, but because I know people who claim to have religious experiences. My grandmother, before she died, she died in 2021, but in 2000, when I was an infant.
A wee little lad.
Yeah, right. She had an experience where I think she recalled seeing heaven and rows of green grass, and some of her dead son at the time, my uncle, he wasn't dead at the time, other family members that she had, and that had changed her life, and she was always happy, and she said she wanted to go back. So whether or not that was something or just a hallucination, it's not something that I can say, but I have seen how it impacts people's lives, and so it is a personal topic for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that, Caleb. I appreciate it. Dale, wrapping up with you, brother man.
NDEs is a topic that I was interested in back in the day. I think I've got like tons of books, at least 20 or more books on NDEs. So there was a time I was really, really into it and stuff like that. So, but I think it's definitely good proof for substance dualism, I would say, and even suggestive of the fact that there is an afterlife. We survive the death of our bodies, or biological death. As to whether the evidence can speak to the nature of the afterlife, I'm really skeptical. I don't think that the evidence speaks either way, and I don't think it's I don't think it's rational. I disagree with Caleb there. I don't think it's rational, even on a balance of probabilities, to assume that they do speak to the nature of the afterlife, given the contextual factors of the fact that we know other people have experiences. They seem just as credible, but they're contradictory. That seems to be a clue. Hey, this is like a parable where or something like that, where God's giving me a message, or there's some point to this or whatever, but it's not speaking to the nature. Oh, hell is like this, heaven's like this, or a Hindu God exists or something like that. Last couple things, just in terms of RSM announcements. So I do have a debate tomorrow with an atheist on the scientific method. Is that better explained on a theistic worldview or an atheistic worldview? And that will be with Darren Lute. And then the next week after, I'm bringing on Dr. Paul Copan, and David Russell will be co-hosting with me to discuss his book, Is God a Moral Monster? Is the God of the Old Testament, I forget Richard Dawkins' famous quote, a malevolent, sexist, pig, bully, all those adjectives. But Paul, we're going to be speaking to Paul to find out if that's true or not. And one last thing, that this is an announcement for a friend. He just launched a new website. So I just want to share that for people. It's sanity.webador.com. Basically, it's a new website. It's anonymous, but they go after the LGBTQ community and also secularists or atheists and stuff like that. That's kind of their target market, and you can see they've got a bunch of stuff. But I just wanted to advertise that. It's at sanity.webador.com for anyone who's interested in that. But thanks for having me. I had fun tonight.
Right on. Caleb, I saw you unmute there for just a second.
All I was going to say is that I look forward to that show, because I'm not the biggest fan of Copan's kind of defense of that. I'm more in the Randall Rouser, Greg Boyd camp, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Awesome.
Right on, guys. All right. And so for Faith Unaltered announcements, we need your help, as I said. So for our co-hosts, if you guys want to do this, our guests, or our audience as well. So we're putting together funds to release and launch a website. David and I have been in talks with a web developer, a website developer, that is going to cost us about $1,000 up front to get a website built and published. And so 200 of that, and I'll just be completely transparent with everybody, 200 of that will go to the hosting platform. So we're thinking WordPress or Squarespace, probably leaning more towards Squarespace. But we would, obviously look at both of them to see which is more cost efficient, which we get more benefits from, yada, yada, yada. And then 800 to the website developer for taking the time to build this, this website. And our goal is ultimately, David and I was in a meeting with this gentleman today at around 10 a.m. And the goal is to have a secondary space to upload our audio to. So if something would ever happen, and I don't foresee this happening, but it's always good to have a backup plan just in case it does. If anything were to ever happen to our stuff on YouTube or anything like that on Spotify, something crazy happens where we get taken off or whatever, we lose access to our channel or whatever, we will have a place to go on the internet and still free for everybody to browse, all of our episodes and things like that for like I said, 100% free. And so that's what we are trying to get in development. Now, we've been in talks with a guy, like I said, and so now I'm making the announcement, and I'll continue to make this announcement for the next few episodes about a fundraising event. And so if you would like to donate to Faith Unaltered, I am encouraging people, if you would like to donate to that particular thing, please do that on either PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App. The reason I say that, and we're probably, I mean, don't get me wrong, we will use super chats on YouTube to do that, but if you donate through YouTube, and I'm going to talk smack about YouTube for a little bit, we only get 60% of what you donate. That goes with super chats, that goes with super thanks, that goes with super stickers, and that's where most of our revenue comes from. And YouTube automatically off the top takes 30% of those funds that you all give to us. 30% of that's going to YouTube. And so with Cash App, Venmo, and I don't know about PayPal, but I know for a fact Cash App, because I use it the most, is maximum, and that's if you want it instantly, it's like 2% or 1.7% that they take from the total donation. If you wait a couple business days, it's free to basically withdraw. And so they're taking nothing off the top if you choose to withdraw that money that y'all put into the Cash App account. If you choose to wait a couple days and then transfer it to your bank account, they take absolutely nothing from that. And so with that being said, if you want to donate to the website funding, then please do that, via Cash App, PayPal, or Venmo. And that link all three of those links are in the link below to our Linktree. So if you look in the description of every single Faith Unaltered episode that we publish on YouTube, we have a link to our Linktree down at the bottom of the description, and that will take you to all three of our PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo links. So Linktree is a fascinating little website that you can put all of your links. So whether it's social media, donate, Gmail, email, whatever, you can put all of your links in this one space to where y'all have access to everything and to, that is associated with Faith Unaltered. So if you want our official PayPal, our Venmo, our Cash App, go to Linktree, and you can do that by clicking the link in the description below, and that will take you to our official Faith Unaltered Cash App, Venmo, and PayPal. So I would encourage everybody, if you want to donate to that, that's what your all's donations are going to be going to for the next however long we can save up. I think off the top of my head, we are right at $400 that we can put into this account right now. And so we've still got $600 to go before we meet the entire $1,000. But that's what we're saving up for now. We've got StreamYard paid off for a year. And so that's great. So all of the extra money that y'all donate to us, which we're thankful for everybody that's been donating to us, that's what it's going to go to. So it's going to go to a really good cause. Also, my next announcement is that y'all are so close to 4,000 subscribers. And we're going to do a little, not a giveaway this time, but we are going to do a special release. And once we hit 4,000 subscribers, we're going to open up a Patreon account. We've been encouraged by y'all that people would pay a monthly donation just for us and for our ministry, that they like what we're doing here. There's been multiple people email me or comment in the comment section or the live chat that they would be absolutely more than happy to give us a monthly reoccurring donation through Patreon. And so we're going to give that back to y'all. So that's what we're going to do with our Patreon account. We're still working through the details about how we want to do the tiers, but I know our Patreon subscribers will at least once a month, get a free, well, not free, you'd be paying, the whatever you pay in Patreon, but you would get a personal live Q&A session with us. So we would live stream a Q&A session, kind of like an open mic to whatever you want to talk about, but only for members. And so that's one of the perks of becoming a Patreon member with Faith Unaltered. And then we're still figuring out what else we want to do. And we would love to take suggestions from y'all. And so please let us know what you would like to see on our Patreon account for members only, and we would be more than happy to put those things into practice. And so with that being said, I just wanted to thank Caleb. I want to thank Josh. I want to thank Dale for coming on here talking about this. I've had a blast, like I said, and like Josh said, earlier, it does not feel like it's been 2.5 hours. It's been a really good conversation, a really fun conversation. and I was excited to have that. I think I picked the best people to have that with. And so I want to thank each and every one of you guys for coming on here and having this discussion with us. With that being said, things to look forward to in the upcoming week. We don't have anything. No, we don't have anything planned for next week. And so, Josh, if you want to do something, or David or Dale or whatever, if not, then we'll probably do another open mic next Friday. That would be the 31st at 7 p.m. Yep, Dale, go ahead.
If you guys have got nothing for next week, I've been pitching you guys. Are you guys interested in biblical prophecy and making a case? Remember, I asked you guys on open mic, like, I'll prepare a presentation, and yeah, okay, cool. I think I'll present something new for you guys. Yeah,
let's do it. Biblical prophecy next Friday, the 31st, May 31st at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Be here for that. What's up, Chris Padeo? I see you in the chat, brother. Thank you for joining us. And then also June, after we get done with May, June 1st, Josh is going to have a special Cosmic Corner episode. The 7th at 11 a.m., we're bringing on Dr. Nathan Jacobs to talk about the philosophy of time and knowledge and God's relationship to time, which is an ongoing series that we've been having. We had a discussion with Dr. William Lane Craig, Dr. David Bradshaw, Warren McGrew, Dr. Alan Rhoda, and now we're bringing on Dr. Nathan Jacobs for another Orthodox perspective on the relationship of God compared to time and his knowledge. And so how does God's knowledge correlate with time? Is it temporal? Is it atemporal? I think I know where Dr. Nathan Jacobs is going to go with this, but I'm not sure. And so I think he would align with Dr. David Bradshaw, affirming the essence and energies distinction, saying, but God is both, outside of time in his essence and inside of time with his energies. I know Dale thinks that's a contradiction, and so I would love to see that kind of hashed out between you, Dale, and Dr. Jacobs, and even if we can bring Dr. Bradshaw back on to elaborate on that a little bit more, I think that would be really interesting. And then also on the 14th, my buddy, so he goes by John 2028, is coming on to discuss, and he's got a YouTube channel, so check out John 2028. But he's going to come on and give his testimony and conversion story. So he's converted from Protestantism to Eastern Orthodoxy, and he asked if he could come on and share, his testimony about doing that. And I said, absolutely. Like, we welcome that 100%. So with that being said, that will be the 14th at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So June 14th, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And also, that does it for our shows. But if y'all want to hear us talk about something specific, we are definitely taking recommendations from our audience for what y'all want to talk about, what you want to hear us talk about. You can email me specifically at faithunaltered@gmail.com. If you would like to be a guest on the show, email me at that same email, faithunaltered@gmail.com, and here I will put it up for people that want to just screenshot it. Super simple. Do that there, and I will get your email, and then I will correspond with you. Also, like I said, I've already mentioned, the PayPal and the Venmo and the Cash App. So please feel free to donate there if you would like to. Please prayerfully consider that because, like I said earlier, we need your help in saving up for this new website that we're trying to get out. So with that being said, again, Caleb, Dale, Josh, thank you guys so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure and a blast, and I can't wait to have you all back on again. And
One more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Before we hop off, to anybody who it's relevant to, we have one listener who is a frequent flyer in our chat over here. His name's Jamie Russell.
What's up, Jamie?
He has a YouTube channel called Jamie Russell-CME, and I'll be talking with him on Sunday about Genesis, spirits, and we're going to talk about what we think about Jordan Peterson and his, let's say, emphasis on the Christian faith, and how we think that's playing into apologetics right now and what good and damage he might be doing. So we're going to be talking about that Sunday afternoon. If anybody's interested in that, check out Jamie Russell-CME on YouTube on Sunday afternoon.
Nice. And you can follow any of us on Facebook. I know we've got TikTok as well and Twitter. So if y'all are regular frequent flyers on there, feel free to add, just search Faith Unaltered, and you will find that on Facebook, Twitter, and X or TikTok as well. So with that being said, y'all, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for checking us out. Like, share, and give the like button a near-death experience before you leave this episode tonight. We love you all. God bless. Stay like Christ.